And this is notification about the recording, which the recording for last night is already on the event page. It's a link to it's hosted on YouTube, so it's a link to YouTube. Uh, I'll provide a link again to the recording for today for people who missed the event. If you are uncomfortable with being included in the recording, you can rename yourself some anonymous thing, and you can turn off your camera. Now, please mute yourselves because I'm going to make it so you can't unmute yourselves here in a minute, and then I'm going to turn it over to John.
All right, not much for me to say. Welcome, everybody. The prime directive of the Moral Psychology Research Group has always been to nurture the work of early career people. So we're excited to hear this morning where the field is going. And with that, I'll thank Thomas for doing this on everybody's behalf and look forward to hearing what people have to say on the Blitz. Thomas, you're especially effective at muting yourself.
Yeah, the funny thing is I have to mute and unmute people so often that I forget that I'm muted and unmuted. I apologize for that. First thing today, we'll do this data blitz. It's less blitzy than normal in the sense that the early career folks used to have far less time to do this than they have today. So they've got 10 minutes, as I'll explain in a couple seconds. Julia Banks, who's a second year PhD student in philosophy at Duke, is going to do the introductions for all of the talks. So she'll do that in a couple minutes. And then later on today, hopefully around 12:30, we'll have a talk from Joanna Demery Cotton, followed by a talk by Paulo Sergio Boggio. And then this afternoon, the keynote address will be Linda Skitka. So I'm very excited to hear all of these talks today. Format of the talks, like I said, the Data Blitz talks are going to be 10 minutes. There'll be no Q&A. But they want feedback. So if you want to send them direct messages, you want to send them an email, you want to post something in the chat, that would be helpful. Main program talks. This is Demery, Cotton, and Bozier. These will be 20 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A, and then Skitka's keynote address will be roughly an hour, followed by a 30-minute Q&A. We'll try to get everybody out of here roughly in time. In terms of participating, so I'm going to mute you guys in just a couple seconds. You won't be able to unmute yourselves during the talks, but you will be able to unmute yourselves during the Q&A. Please raise your hand and we'll try to field as many questions as possible within the allotted time. Please limit yourself to one question and make sure that your question is actually a question. If you ask a question, please leave your hand raised until the speaker has finished responding so you don't like move around on the screen mid discussion. And if we don't have time to field your questions, our apologies. Obviously, like I said, you can just post stuff in the chat. Okay, so yesterday I posted a link for a survey if you want to be added to our listserv, which we're going to update after the conference. Here is the QR code for that. I'll show it again at the end of today. Okay. So that's it. That's it. My part is over for now. I know I got to pin a couple people. Hold on a second here. Julia, where are you? God, there's so many folks that I have co-host here right now. Right, I'm going to pin Julia, and then I'm also going to pin our first speaker. Okay, Julia, go ahead.
Okay. Welcome everybody to the Data Blitz. I'll just jump right in and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker will be David Camper. Dave is a third-year PhD student at UCLA, and his talk is entitled Authority and Copyright Infringement: How Fame Shapes Moral Judgments of Fair Use. David, take it away.
All right. Let me share my screen. Let's see. All right. All right. Can everyone see that? Brilliant. All right. So, let's see here. Okay. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for, I'm going to talk to everyone about fame and copyright. And the one question I'm going to that's the through line through all of this is does who you are affect how people judge copyright cases? And this is work that I'm doing with an RA, Becca Bedell, and my primary advisor, Keith Holyoke. I'm just going to give a quick roadmap of what we're going to cover today. First off, I'm going to give a little bit of the introduction of just about the puzzle that started this research, namely this fair use paradox. I'll discuss fair use in a second. And this fame bias copyright judgments in all of this. The study that we have a few studies, I'm going to be simply talking about study one today, that found what we found about a victim vulnerability. And it's a 2x2 design, artist fame and victim fame. And I call this the dual process model of fame bias. And I'll talk about some implications, namely that fame creates this sort of systematic bias in fair use, and it challenges at least this reasonable person standard that we qualify uh, within copyright law. And I'll discuss maybe some conclusions and implications as a part of this, but if I have the time, I'll try to be quick and we'll verbose. So this is the real case that inspired this research. I'm also doing law as well at UCLA. This is some of our, this is a case that was coming up in 2023. This is Goldsmith v. Warhol. In the left image, we've got Lynn Goldsmith's photo from 1981. She's a professional photographer. Ostensibly, she wrote in her litigation that this is an intimate, realistic portrait of Prince. It shows him as vulnerable and human, and she described it within her within her complaint as a sort of fragile image of Prince. Now, on the right image, you've got Andy Warhol's Orange Prince from 1984. It's that iconic Warhol print where it's purple face, pop art sort of style. The facts of this case, Warhol v. Goldsmith, was that Warhol used Goldsmith's photo without her permission. So this is an argument that could be created under fair use, and created 16 different Prince artworks from it. And years later, the Warhol Foundation licensed this for about $10,000, and Goldsmith sued, said that that's my photo. So this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court to look at a few different cases or factors within fair use, namely that was it sufficiently transformative? And the court ruled that this is in fact not fair use. What the court said is that basically the works serve similar commercial purposes, but fundamentally that they weren't transformative enough. And you can't add your signature style to someone's work. But here's what is interesting. We have one of the Supreme Court justices, a woman by the name of Elena Kagan. She asked a really important question during an oral argument as a part of this. Namely, her point was about hindsight. She said to the Warhol Foundation lawyer, she said, "I wonder, Mr. Martinez, if your case doesn't benefit from some sort of hindsight. Today we know that Warhol was a famous pop artist. Today we know his style is iconic and valuable. We know that museums display his work. So it's easy for us to see that his work is transformative." She, again, was in the dissent. In this case, she's a part of the two. She found the work to be sufficiently transformative. But she said, perhaps it's the case that imagine Warhol was some unknown artist, and just as some struggling young guy nobody heard of, if we look at these two images again, you might think that this is not that impressive. And so we can't rule out the fact that Andy Warhol is Andy Warhol. So some fame might be doing some work here. Are we saying that these two images are transformative because Warhol is famous? And would we say the same thing if he was a nobody? And this is our research question. Briefly on fair use, just to explain it, there's four factors under 17 U.S. Code Section 107. The four statutory factors are purpose and character. Is it transformative? The second one, or adding new meaning or message. Parody is an example of this. You also have nature of the original. Is the original work creative, or is it factual, like a phone book? There's more protection for creative works. The amount used, how much was it taken? Is it a small part, a whole part? And then the market effect on the original work. And this is all grounded, at least in this reasonable person standard. First off, this is the defense. So a defense is saying, I can take this work with modify it sufficiently, and it can be somewhat novel. So the idea is that the reasonable person standard, courts assume that these people can judge these factors objectively, like a neutral, fair observer. But Justice Kagan's question challenges this. What if fame creates this bias? What if we can't be objective about famous people? So we assume this objective evaluation, but can subjective biases like fame distort judgment? So we tried to ask this question: does fame create sets of biases? Um, we had a two by two factorial design between subjects, and we wanted to manipulate whether the artist's fame was either famous or less famous, and whether the victim's fame was either famous or less famous. And this creates four possible conditions. We had an N of 244. They passed attention checks and comprehension checks. Each person saw one scenario. They were randomly assigned to four conditions. Either there was a famous source artist and a famous victim, either a famous source artist or a less famous victim, a less famous source artist and a famous victim, or a less famous artist as a source, as well as a less famous victim as its derivative artwork. Um, what participants read was that there was this fictional scenario between Martinez and Rivera. Alex Martinez was the visual artist, and Jamie Rivera was the photographer, modeled very much off of the Warhol v. Goldsmith case. And what happened was, is Rivera, excuse me, took a landscape photograph, and that he used that photograph without permission, just as would be the case within fair use. And Martinez changed colors and added text, and he sold the prints for $500 each. But Rivera objected, and Martinez claimed fair use, saying that it was sufficiently transformative, and that the artwork was displayed in a gallery anyway. Importantly, for fame manipulations, for the famous person, they were world-renowned artists featured in major museums and had a large following, while the less famous artists had relatively unknown. They were shown at small local galleries, and there was a small following. Everything else was kept exactly the same. The only modification was the fame descriptions. We had quite a few quantitative measures and open-ended responses. Namely, there was legal and fair use questions. First off, should Alex Martinez be allowed to sell this collage without Jamie Rivera's permission? Should Martinez sold the artwork for 500? So this is what we call the market effect question. This would be the market effect question. A 5-point scale on whether Martinez's work would reduce the value of Rivera's original work. If you want a jury, who would you rule in favor of, as well as an open-ended response, which I will get back to in some of our analyses. We also had moral judgments, namely how wrong was it? To what extent Victor Rivera was a victim in this situation? Again, I mean, it may be the case that, and this was part of the majority's argument within Warhol v. Goldsmith, that Warhol sort of maybe made Goldsmith famous. So perhaps this is something that it's actually not a victim in the end, even if she took the artwork. Uh, it could have been the case that Rivera is actually made more famous by this. Do you think that Martinez was aware that Rivera might object to this use? That could be an argument. How unfair was Martinez's treatment of Rivera, and did Martinez violate Rivera's artistic rights as a photographer? The next set of questions was punishment and payment. How much punishment, if any, does Martinez deserve? Should Martinez have to pay Rivera for this photograph? And we asked also about harm assessment, namely, how much financial harm did Martinez suffer? How much reputational harm did Rivera suffer? And how much emotional distress do you think Rivera experienced? And in general, how much harm did Rivera suffer at all? Notably, and this is now getting to the results, that across the board, that there was a ceiling effect across all jury verdicts. So in these legal judgments, so everyone thought that Rivera was in the wrong for taking this. In those cases, underneath fair use, that was not significant. So the fair use question, the jury verdict question was not significant. The payment obligation was not significant, and the market effect cost was not significant. But one effect does break through, and this is at least the reduces market value effect. We found that there was, interestingly enough, the less famous person was seen as not having reducing the market value as opposed to someone who is a famous victim. It may be the case that basically the argument goes they have more built-in effects against having a reduction in market value, and that's due to the part that they basically have more money that they can deal with these sort of questions. So we have all these ceiling effects across the board for any of the legal questions. Everyone agrees that Rivera was in the wrong. Sorry, Martinez was in the wrong for all of this. So how is it the case that we might have? What are some of the mechanisms we want to think about? So everyone agrees, but why? First off, victim perception might be the key factor here. Namely, that there was a safety effect of either if for less famous victims were seen as being more victims in this case, and it may be the case that famous artists were judged more harshly. In this case, that there's emotional distress. This is a major significant finding across.
I don't know. It's frozen on my end.
Yeah, he's frozen for me too.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I'm not sure what to do with that. He was at the 10-minute mark. I didn't set it up this way. I definitely don't have it set up to automatically cut people off. Um, hmm.
If it's 10 minutes, move on.
All right. Sounds good. We'll have to do that. Oh, there we go. All right. Let me pin. I gotta do some pinning and unpinning again.
While you do the pinning and unpinning, I
Yeah,
will
perfect.
introduce our next Blitz speaker. So our next speaker will be Paige Amormino. Dr. Amormino is a postdoc at Penn State, and her talk will be entitled, "Does the Moral Status of the Beneficiary Matter, and to Whom?" So welcome, Paige.
Hi, thank you for the intro. Okay. Share screen. Oh, yay, I can do that. Okay. Does this look, can I have a thumbs up from someone? Y'all can see my screen with the title on it? Or no?
Yes.
Oh, yeah? Oh, perfect.
Right
Okay,
now,
cool.
yep.
Cool. I'll get started. In our interviews with altruistic kidney donors, we found some interesting trends that I want to open with. So, one 23-year-old non-directed kidney donor, so someone who's given a kidney to a complete stranger, recounted their experience talking with friends. And then I invariably got the question of why would you do this for someone you don't know? That's the question that came up most often. What if they're a bad person? I was always struck by that question more than anything. Another altruistic kidney donor recounts, of course, then people kid you, oh, what if it's a homophobic Nazi? And it's like, well, if he needs a kidney, I don't get to choose, you know? So why do some people help strangers? Even strangers who might be antagonistic, whose moral character is unknowable. I want to present three hypotheses for why this might be the case. They're not competing, they're not mutually exclusive, just, they could be working, could be all, could be any. One is stricter moral standards for oneself. Maybe they're higher in moral scrupulosity, moral self-monitoring. They have strong injunctive moral norms for oneself, and that's why they feel compelled to help strangers that they don't know. Another is just having more optimistic beliefs about human nature, being less cynical, having higher general trust. Another is a reduced reliance on moral deservingness as a condition for helping in the first place. So we wanted to entertain these three hypotheses with extraordinary altruists, people who have given to strangers who you don't know if they're deserving or not. So to do this, we recruited 172 extraordinary altruists and 118 controls. We did our best to demographically match controls, but there's some quirks to our sample. The altruists were a little bit richer and a little bit younger, just sampling quirk. We control for age, gender, and income in all our analyses. So who were the altruists? We had a heterogeneous group of six different altruistic groups. So liver donors, organ donors, in general, humanitarian aid workers, that could be Red Cross International or Doctors Without Borders, giving aid in war-torn, dangerous areas. Carnegie Hero Medals recipients are people who have risked their lives to save others. Think rescuing a drowning stranger, rescuing someone out of a burning building. Then you'll notice we have the two kidney donor categories. Directed kidney donors is you might be aware of who the recipient might be. So maybe it's your sibling, but it could also just be a neighbor or a local teacher who posted in need on a Facebook group. So that can really kind of vary. Whereas the NDD, non-directed kidney donors are, you're just signing up for whoever is the best match for you on the list of who needs a kidney. So in theory, the non-directed donors are like the more true, pure altruists, but we're including both groups because it's still pretty nice to give your kidney. So first hypothesis or question, do altruists have stricter moral standards for oneself? We had the altruists and controls answer these four kind of measures, constructs to get at this. The first one is identification with the moral self. For that measurement, we used the identity pill task from Strominger and Nichols, where basically they say, imagine you took a pill where it changed, everything was the same about you except for one thing. How much of a change in your overall self would it be from 0 to 100%? So for preferences, it's like, imagine that your taste in movies or your favorite song changed. For moral self, it's like, imagine that everything about you is the same except for that you condone murder. How much of a change is that? And then you can look at that delta for getting a sense of identification with moral self. Moral essentialism is a 3-item subscale from kind of more general essentialism measures. So an item is a person's moral character, is something very basic about them and can't be changed much. Moral disengagement, kind of displacing blame, culpability, just kind of those types of themes. An example question or example item is people cannot be blamed for misbehaving if their friends pressure them into doing it. Moral scrupulosity. So that one, there wasn't really a measure we could find, so we were kind of creative with it. Basically, we asked altruists and controls to think about how many moral shortcomings, moral failings, or transgressions they can think of themselves having committed in the past 2 weeks. And so then we count how many they nominated, and then we also had coders look at the moral severity of that transgression with the idea that altruists might be able to think of more moral failings and keep themselves more morally accountable, but maybe the degree of severity of those transgressions are like much less severe, like failing to open the door for someone. So across all those four measures, we found no significant differences between these two groups. So we kind of just across the board, do the altruists have stricter moral standards for oneself? Not in the way we're measuring it. So not with these kind of more targeted moral constructs that we're using here. So then the next question, how about do altruists have more optimistic beliefs about human nature? So we had the altruists and controls do 6 measures here. Generalized trust. This is from the World Values Survey. It's a single item with a dichotomous outcome of do you think that most people can be trusted versus you can't be too careful? You can tell it wasn't designed by a psychologist, but it's nice because you can compare it across lots of populations. A lot of people use this item. Cynicism. We also have gratitude, appreciation of moral excellence. That has an example item of when I witness someone doing something good for others without reciprocation, I feel a lot of appreciation. So it's kind of like appreciation or gratitude, but more specifically in the moral domain. Unlimited empathy belief is just a 1-item Likert scale of people have infinite empathy. How much do you agree with that? And then primal world beliefs is a much broader, zoomed out world belief inventory with 99 foundational beliefs ranging from really broad ideas about the world, like the world is good, to really nuanced kind of beliefs. So were there group differences here? The top 4, yes, the bottom 2, no. So it seems that things that have more to do with beliefs about human nature specifically, trusting people, not being a cynic, having more gratitude and appreciation, yes, altruists, higher trust, higher gratitude, higher appreciation, lower cynicism. When it comes to more of those abstract ideas, like infinite empathy versus not finite empathy, fixed resource, primal world beliefs, just kind of general worldviews in general, not different between altruists and controls. Lastly, do altruists care less about the moral status of the target? So first we have altruists and controls do this dictator game. They decide how to allocate $10 between themselves and a nameless stranger. Then we tell them about another participant who had just done the same task. But that person was either selfish and kept all the money for themselves, was fair, split it 50-50, or was selfless and gave all their money away. Then we say, how much would you like to give to that previous participant? So um, we then kind of modeled that moral discounting. So for modeling it, we dummy coded selfless, fair, and selfish as 0, 1, 2, with the idea that, well, how much generosity are you willing to engage with someone who is of increasingly worse moral status? And so if someone's more generous, you would expect them to have higher values on the y-axis. And if someone discounts less the moral status of the other person, you would expect their slope to be more shallow. And that's what we find here. The altruists are consistently more generous at each level and have a shallower discounting rate, meaning that their slope is more shallow. So, conclusions. We're against this strong moral compass hypothesis. Altruists don't differ from controls in moral essentialism, disengagement, self-importance, but what actually sets them apart is a more optimistic belief or disposition about human nature. But there's not really a difference for these more global or abstract beliefs. And when we look at their pro-social tendencies, it looks like altruists don't have as much of a strong link between the recipient's moral status and the willingness to engage in help with that recipient. And we're terming that reduced moral discounting. So it kind of seems to suggest that altruists are less punitive or conditional in their altruism. A question for the Zoom room. I know we don't really have time for questions, so please just put it in the chat. What do you guys think of, like, I'm writing this up. I'm having such a hard time getting this into one title. Extraordinary altruists are defined by moral generosity, but not strict moral scrutiny. Moral generosity, to me, almost feels a little too vague, but I don't know. They help regardless of deservingness. They are defined by trust, not strict moral scrutiny. You can see that, like, I don't like long titles, and I'm becoming my own worst enemy. So if people have thoughts, feel free to either, DM me or put it in the chat. This would be super helpful while I'm doing the write-up. I like to have the title while I'm framing things, and I don't have a good deliverable here. But on a more bright note, I want to thank my collaborators, Dr. Williams, Dr. Law, and Dr. Marsh, the Primals Project for funding this research, and I have a QR code for my website. Thank you all.
Paige, that was great. Thanks. All right, Julia.
Yes, thank you. That was great. So I will get on to introducing our next speaker. Our next speaker will be Abigail Casario. She's a fourth-year PhD student at Michigan State University, and her talk will be entitled Conviction Cascades, Moral Conviction Transmits Through Belief System Ties.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So hi, my name is Abby Casario. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at Michigan State University, and today I'll be talking about the role of belief system ties in facilitating the transmission of moral conviction. So moral conviction is defined as the meta-perception that an attitude or an identity reflects one's core sense of right versus wrong. And importantly, this varies both by attitude and by person. So I can moralize my attitude towards abortion, but not progressive taxation. And Thomas, for instance, may do the opposite. And moral conviction has received a lot of attention in the literature lately because it has been shown to predict a number of really important outcomes. It predicts reduced political compromise on moralized issues. It facilitates affective polarization and social distance between those who disagree on moral issues, so people are less likely to be friends and are more likely to dislike those who disagree on moral issues. And it predicts people turning up to protest and whether those protests turn violent. But this project talks about an important precursor to these implications, and that is the process of moralization, which is how an attitude or an identity attains or increases in moral conviction to begin with. So how do attitudes become moralized? Moralization is an area of ongoing research that remains poorly understood. Early attempts to adapt theories of moral judgment to the process of moralization left a lot to be desired. For instance, Implicit perceptions of harm and incidental emotion have been found to be relatively poor predictors of attitude moralization. In contrast, recent research has identified intra-attitude features, such as moral values or explicit attitude-relevant emotion, as being important predictors of moral conviction. So we build on this work by arguing that because moral conviction is an explicitly reported metacognitive property of attitudes, we should also consider inter-attitude structure when we're thinking about the process of moralization. We know that attitudes do not operate in isolation. Instead, they're embedded into a broader belief system with causal connections between attitudes and identities. And we know that inconsistency between closely connected beliefs or attitudes increases cognitive dissonance, which people are motivated to avoid. So what we argue here is that attitudes that are closely connected to moralized beliefs should be more likely to become moralized over time, because one way to remedy that dissonance is to bring the previously non-moralized belief into the moral domain to achieve consistency between two closely connected attitudes. To test this idea, we begin by building a formal model where we adapt a dynamic icing model for the 0-1 domain, 0 being non-moralized and 1 being moralized. And we use this model because it allows us to model reciprocal influence between nodes in a broader belief system onto each other. And for us, it allows us to model how moral conviction might spread through a belief system from a patient node over time as it exerts influence on its neighbors. So for study one, I conducted a simulation study where I implemented this dynamic process in code. I simulated networks of different commonly occurring structures, including a fully connected belief system where all attitudes and identities are connected to one another, and belief systems with distinct social and economic attitude neighborhoods that are connected by a single bridge. I then varied the connectivity in each of these kinds of belief systems so that connectivity was weak, moderate, or strong. I then simulated 1,000 networks of each of these types of belief systems over 5 time points. First, I tested whether, in line with the math of my theory, moral conviction is spreading from that patient node that wants to be moralized through the belief system over time. And second, I tested whether spread was more efficient in densely connected networks where nodes are more interconnected to each other and there's more consistency pressure with that patient node. And indeed, in line with our theoretical framework, we see that moral conviction is spreading from that patient node over time. And spread is most efficient, interestingly, in densely connected networks where all attitudes are connected to one another. So in summary, our simulation study confirms the mathematical logic of our theory. Moral conviction is spreading from that patient node in the network over time. And moral conviction is spreading more efficiently through dense belief systems where there is more consistency pressure and opportunity for spread. Next, we wanted to get some empirical evidence as to whether this is happening in real belief systems. So what we did is we conducted 3 panel studies where in all studies we measured each individual's belief system using the conceptual similarity task at time 1. And I'll walk through what this task does on the next slide. And then we measured moral conviction of all attitudes in the belief system at all time points in each study. So what we do in this conceptual similarity task is we tell respondents to rate the extent 2 political attitudes are to co-occur. So for instance, we might ask a person, imagine that you support the Democratic Party. How likely is it that you support gun rights? And they will rate the co-occurrence of those attitudes on a scale ranging from 1, not at all likely, to 7, very likely, with a scale midpoint of 4, which is essentially neutral, no connection between the attitudes. We then center that scale on the scale midpoint of 4, so that becomes 0, and take the absolute value so that the highest value on the scale, 3, represents a strong positive or negative tie between those attitudes, meaning there's going to be a moral conviction pressure. So what we do is to test our predictions, we first fit a multi-level model where we regress time 2 moral conviction for the first attitude in the pair on time 1 moral conviction for the first attitude, time 1 moral conviction for the second attitude, the tie between the attitude, so how closely connected they are to one another, and the interaction between time 1 moral conviction for the second attitude and the tie. And this is our term of interest. And we within-person center all predictors so that we're examining within-person change in moralization and attitudes over time. Second, to test the second prediction, which is that denser belief systems should be more moralized because there's more opportunity for spread, we regress belief system moralization at time 1 on belief system density at time 1. And this is just a linear regression, person-level analysis at one time point. So what we see is in line with our theoretical framework, we see that moral conviction of the second attitude at the first time point predicts increased moralization of the second attitude or the first attitude at the later point if the attitudes are closely connected to one another and that first attitude is highly moralized. So we see in line with our theoretical framework, moral conviction is indeed spreading between these highly connected nodes over time. Relatedly, we also see that as belief systems become denser, they're more likely to be highly moralized, suggesting that that density is facilitating increased spread. So in sum, our empirical studies show that moral conviction is indeed spreading over time through belief systems in line with the first prediction of our theoretical model. And second, we are observing that dense belief systems are moralized belief systems, suggesting that as there's more opportunity for moral conviction to spread in belief systems, the more moral conviction or the more moralization is in the belief system overall. Finally, theory predicts and our empirical studies show that moral conviction transmits more efficiently through densely connected networks. And we know from research in political behavior that partisan and ideological sorting have increased over time. And our model predicts that this increased connectivity and consistency should mean more moralized belief systems. When we look at ANES belief system, when we look at population average belief systems and ANES data over time, we see that they are indeed increasing in connectivity. And when we plug in this increasing connectivity into our theoretical model, it does indeed seem to be facilitating increased belief system moralization. So in conclusion, we argue that inner attitude structure is an important but overlooked feature that predicts attitude moralization as people seek to hold consistent moral beliefs. Panel studies provide evidence that moral conviction can spread through highly moralized nodes to connected neighbors. And we also observe evidence that those with densely connected belief systems, such as people who are ideological and think carefully about politics, tend to have more moralized belief systems as well. And finally, we argue that changes in population average belief system connectivity over time imply that there could be more hyper-moralized sectarian belief systems in the population as the average belief system has more opportunity for moral conviction to spread. So thank you so much for your time. And if you're interested in this research or have any questions, please feel free to email me at casario@msu.edu.
Thank you. Julie, go ahead.
Yep. Thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Ivy Gilbert. Ivy is a fifth-year PhD candidate at Cornell, and her talk was entitled Anthropomorphic Animal Mascots and the Inversion of Moral Patiency in Meat. Take it away, Ivy.
All right. Can everyone see my slides? No.
Yeah. Oh, not yet.
Nope, not yet. How
Yep.
about now? Good? Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Ivy. I work with Dr. Laura Nemi at Cornell, and I have changed the title of my talk slightly. I'm now talking to you about animal mascots and consent in meat marketing. So I will open by inviting you to think about if you want to sell meat products, how should you represent animals in visual marketing materials? If you want people to buy your product, you probably want to avoid triggering empathy or any reflection about the morality of eating meat, about animal mind, whether they can suffer or feel pain. And prior work in psychology supports this intuition. Meat eating is facilitated by denying mind to animals, or at least the kinds of minds that would make them worthy of moral consideration, like a mind that can suffer and experience emotion. And meat eating is reduced by cues of animal cuteness or perceived similarity to humans. And so, in this way, cute and human-like animals should theoretically be an anti-marketing strategy. But meat marketing is replete with smiling animals who even wear human clothes and seem capable of both emotion and cognition. This is particularly typical, I've noticed, of barbecue restaurants, but it's not exclusive to meat. It's common in dairy marketing as well. And it seems like a really bad marketing strategy. And so this work is motivated by the question, why, despite evidence that sentience reduces willingness to eat meat, are anthropomorphic animals such a staple of meat marketing? And perhaps it's the case that these mascots signal consent. Explicit permission given via smiling and gesturing, these sort of human markers of consent and approval that may help reduce dissonance about meat eating. And so in this work, we test a theory of consent by showing participants different barbecue logos featuring more or less realistic pig mascots. And then we measure a variety of moral evaluations and consumption judgments, including edibility, willingness to consume the animal in the image, mind perception, and perceived consent and passivity. We also measured meat masculinity attitudes as a covariate using this masculinity of meat scale. This measures endorsement of gendered stereotypes about meat consumption. So it's a composite of 7 items, like a real man would never turn down a steak or vegetarian is wimpy, all on scales from 1 to 5. And here are logos for study 1. We showed participants these pigs and barbecue logos, again, varied for realism and anthropomorphism. So we had a real animal, an illustrated animal, a cute animal, and then an anthropomorphic cute animal. And first of all, in study 1, across a series of ANCOVAs, we found that higher meat masculinity attitudes, higher mom scores, amplified ratings on most measures. So endorsement of gendered attitudes about meat increased willingness to eat the animal, positive affect, perceived consent, while lowering perceived experience. And we found that consumption attitudes increased by artistically rendering the pig, mostly regardless of whether it was merely illustrated or anthropomorphic cartoon. The cartoon mascots were perceived as lower in experience, but among participants higher in moms, cartoons were actually more agentic. So for those participants high in moms, the pig in the hat can think. And so we wondered, if the pig can think, can it also consent? And it appears so, though the effect was only approaching significance, consent was highest for the accessorized anthropomorphic pig. And the gap widens as moms gets higher, amplifying perceived consent specifically for that accessorized pig. And in exploratory mediation models, we found that our consumption measures were mediated by perceived consent, not any other measures, and the mediation was only significant in the case of the accessorized pig. But how are our participants thinking about consent? We don't know whether people saw this as like, this pig is passively consenting, or as authority. This pig is in charge and can give permission to do. These are very different interpretations of consent. Prior work from Joanna Demery Cotton, who I believe is here and who we'll hear from after the data blitz session, shows that perceptions of consent in cognitively impaired agents are mixed. And so it's unclear which definition of consent our participants were working with. And there's no prior work on perceptions of consent in farmed animals. So, and we might argue that they're cognitively impaired in a sense compared with humans. So when our participants are thinking about the pig consenting, do their evaluations look like human consent interpretation processes? So in study 2, we manipulated the logo's gender to see whether participants' reasoning looked more like objectification or passive consent, or like permission giving authority, and we added measures of authority and confidence. So we hypothesized that insofar as both feminized and masculinized pigs are perceived as consenting to consumption, the pathway to consent will differ by gender. So we thought that the feminized and the neutral pigs would track more closely together, and that they would consent via passivity, while the masculinized pigs would convey authority. And our hypothesis was informed by the feminist theorist Carol Adams' argument that the sexualization of animals and the animalization of women go hand in hand. Psychological research supports this link, finding that speciesism, or discrimination based on species membership, predicts endorsement of more traditional forms of discrimination like racism and sexism. And visual tropes in pornography often mirror those used to depict happy, willing animals in meat advertisements. And in both, pleasure signals replace suffering, so consumption is somehow justified. These consenting animals, we think, fit into these gendered schemas of domination, meat and masculinity on one side and submission and femininity on the other. So in study 2, here were our logos. We had a neutral, gender neutral, a feminized and a masculinized logo, mimicking logos that I have documented at length in the wild, so to speak. And we again saw an overall amplifying effect of meat masculinity attitudes. We found that now the neutral mascot was considered the most consumable. and was rated higher in experience relative both to agency and to the other two gendered mascots. It was considered the least authoritative, and it was the most passive and the most consenting. As we thought, feminized mascots generally tracked neutral mascots, following the same overall pattern. And we found that across mediation models, perceived consent again drove consumption judgments. And as hypothesized, the pathway to consent was sensitive to gender. So, though gendered mascots were overall less consenting and consumable than neutral ones, to the extent that they were seen as consenting, two different pathways to consent emerged. The feminine and neutral animals, as if they're saying, they're passive, so they don't mind. And the masculine animals seem to be saying, we're powerful, we chose this. So, by depicting animals as consenting, brands can create a comforting story or a visual myth that harm is voluntary and benign. And these cues help consumers to maintain beliefs in moral acceptability, even when the underlying systems objectively involve suffering. Elsewhere in my research, I have explored happy animal narratives in the dairy industry and documented how they seem to mollify public concerns about animal harm, which in turn affects consumer behavior. So, in future work, I would really love to probe beliefs about consent and social contracts with domesticated animals. Before starting my PhD, I worked in the animal advocacy space. I worked with PETA. I worked with the Humane League, Farm Sanctuary, including doing outreach out in the field. And in the field, you hear this quite a lot that that's what animals are here for. They wouldn't be able to survive without farmers to care for them. It's a reciprocal, mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that understanding these beliefs and which animals we have them about would be really useful. Other work from our lab exploring how dairy farmers talk about their relationships with cows hints at the existence of human-animal contract schemas. We've documented references to reciprocal relationships in dairy farming, that farmers care for their cows and in return, cows provide milk. So I'd love to look next at how prevalent this kind of thinking is and whether we have a folk conception of animal consent. For instance, do we think that animals can both give and withdraw consent or only give it? And how does this affect our attitudes toward consumption and animal harm? So thank you. I'd love to also thank my advisor, my mentors and collaborators. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ivy. Our next speaker will be Jason Lamb. Jason is a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Southampton. His talk will be entitled "Incongruent Metaethical Rhetoric Amplifies the Perceived Warmth Confidence." Take it away, Jason.
Hello? Okay. Hello, I'm Jason. I'm studying at Southampton, UK. So today I'll talk about some results of my working paper about metaethical stances and social perception. So let's first start with scenario. So you have a Sylvia here. So Sylvia cares deeply for her ill mother and is dedicated to returning flavors. So last month, she borrowed money from a friend to cover her mother's medical expenses, promising to repay it this month. Her friend, however, urgently needed a repayment to repair water damage at her home. Yet Sylvia's mother required one last critical treatment, costing all the money she intended to repay. So now you have a Jackie, and Jackie has an opinion. Jackie thinks that the moral thing for Sylvia to do is clear and easy to decide. Jackie thinks that there's only one more right choice, no matter Sylvia's background, beliefs, etc. There's only one right choice for everyone, no matter the circumstances. So this stance is consistent with the objectivism. It's generally about morality being absolute, universal, independent of personal perspectives. So when Jackie says that, perhaps you may feel that Jackie has a very high moral clarity. Jackie feels so certain about their opinion and high in agency. And this kind of developed and helped to construct a competent stereotype. Whereas Jackie can say, oh, it is, very unclear and difficult to decide. There's more than one morally right choice. Whatever Sylvia choose will depend on her background, belief, and cultures. So this rhetoric is very consistent with relativism, basically talking about morality is a subjective variable. So when Jackie says that, perhaps you may feel that Jackie is quite inclusive. Jackie is very tolerant and empathetic. So that kind of rhetoric kind of pursued, developed a warmth impression. So in study one, we have 260 American, and we just assign them to see either a objectivistic Jackie or relativistic Jackie. And we measure about warmth and competence, of course. So competence basically something like independent, intelligence, confident. And warmth would be something like good nature, friendly, or tolerant. So what do people think about the objectivistic Jackie? They think, yes, the objectivistic Jackie is more competent than their warm. And the relativistic Jackie, they're warmer than competent. So there's a warmth competent trade-off. So what do we learn from study one? Yes, taking an objectivistic stance will make you look more competent than you are warm. Whereas when you take a relativistic stances, you will look warmer than competent. However, we did not really account for the similarity between the target and the participants. Perhaps if you are very similar in the meta-ethical stance with the target, perhaps it will change your perception of the stereotypes. So in study 2B, we have like 400 Americans. We try to see if the similarity level will moderate the warmth competence trade-off. So at FH level, you can see people still think that relativistic Jackie look warmer than competent, objectivistic Jackie more competent than warm. However, when it is high similarity, basically means that they are judging their in-group member. When relativistic participant judging relativistic Jackie, there's some difference, but it's not that significant. And it is the same for the objectivistic part. When both targets and participants are objectivistic, there's some difference, but not significant. However, when it is low similarity, which means you're basically judging your outgroup member, the objectivistic participant judging the relativistic Jackie, yes, they do see the relativistic Jackie as warmer than they are competent, whereas the relativistic participant judging the objectivistic Jackie, they do think the Jackie is more competent than the warm. So that you can see the warmth competence trade-off start to grow as the similarity in the meta-ethical stances lowers. So what there's another interpretation for this three-way interaction. We can just focus on the target itself. So for example, if we focus on the relativistic Jackie, the target, we can see that the similarity level did not really change the difference between the competence and warmth. So for example, in the high similarity, the relativistic participant do not really, there's some difference in the warmth and competence, but still, even the objectivistic participant will still think, the difference is there, but it is very stable across similarity level. However, it is not that stable when the target is objectivistic. So you can see that the difference start to widen for the objectivistic target as the similarity goes down, especially for warmth. So you can see that although competence drop, the warmth drop more. So what do we learn from this study two? So meta-ethical similarity affected social perception. Higher similarity will give an overall more positive perception with lower, less intense trade-off. However, if you have lower similarity, you have overall more negative perception, but with a stronger trade-off. Importantly, we also found that relativists as participants penalize the warmth impression more than they do on competence impression. So one interpretation is that perhaps the objectivistic characteristics looks vicious in the relativist mind. So for example, what do we mean by vice for the characteristic? For example, relativists may think that, oh, Jackie seems to ignore the complexity and nuances in the moral decision. Jackie seems overconfident in believing what moral principles should be applied. The objectivistic Jackie seems motivated to impose their personal moral belief on other people. So we are interested to see if the perceived vice will actually moderate the effect between the similarity and trait. So we have study 3. So in study 3, when the vice is like at the average level, so in this study, we only focus on objectivistic Jackie. So everyone will see only objectivistic Jackie. So as you can see, as the similarity goes down, yes, the gap between the competence and warmth widen, with warmth drop steeper than the competence. However, in the high vice scenarios where there's a bunch of participants think that the objectivity is really vicious with their characteristic, even though they're sharing the same stance, that the gap between competence and warmth is also widened, but it is more than when the vice is at the average level. Then, when you look at the low vice, the gap between competence and warmth is gone. So what we can conclude kind of is that the similarity will actually affect the gap between the warmth and competence only when the participant actually see the objectivistic characteristic as vicious. Whereas when they don't, the similarity level did not really do anything about creating a gap between the warmth and competence. So what we learned, yes, relativists will penalize objectivistic characteristic on warmth more than competence, partly because of the perceived vice in the objectivistic characteristics. It's because, for example, warmth could be fragile. They are socially diagnostic in interpersonal relationship than the competence. And since relativists really care about the warmth and inclusivity and the empathetic concern, for example, then they do look for that in other people. So when objectivist, well, the stance is actually kind of not opposite, but kind of undermine those qualities, then in terms of relativist eyes, they are not that nice. So the take-home message is that perhaps you may want to think twice when taking objectivistic stance in public about moral dilemmas, because perhaps you may be seen as colder than you thought you would be. So this is the end of my presentation, and this is the people, is me and my supervisor, Paul. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. All right, up next, we have Paul McKee. Paul is a fifth-year PhD candidate in psychology and neuroscience at Duke, and his talk will be entitled Moral Motivations in Real-World Moral Dilemmas. Paul, whenever you're ready.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see. Slideshow. Do you guys see my presentation view or the whole, or just this slide?
Presentation view.
Ah, that's all right. I don't need to use it. Let's go. How's that? Good? Great. I'm going to start my timer so I don't go over. Beautiful. Well, hello, guys. Pleasure to be here in all the talks and to see everyone in the audience. Thanks for coming. I'm going to give a talk that's in a much earlier stage than pretty much every other data blitz we've heard so far. But we're excited about it as a team, and hopefully you guys find it interesting. But keep that in mind that it's a very quick and dirty analysis of something that's just started. I wanted to start by, let me get these faces out of here. I wanted to start by introducing and just thanking my wonderful team. Couldn't do any of my research without my teams, and this one is phenomenal, many of whom are in the audience. Brianna's going to give a talk next, and probably kill it per usual. But yeah, this is a great team. Let's see, next slide. All right. So normally in moral psychology, or not normally, but most often, studies have kind of focused on moral decision making, moral judgments, right? And trolley problem is an example of one. So we've done this in the lab. This is obviously a joke trolley problem, but the essence is the same, right? Do you pull the lever? How do you judge people that pull the lever? And we've also kind of done some study of this in the wild, right? These bait bikes where they put a bike attached to a string and they see if people steal it, and you see if people steal it, and then you judge them and stuff like that. So we spent a lot of time focusing on moral decision making and moral judgments, but I think not enough time on moral motivation. And when we have looked at moral motivation in the past, it feels like it's lacking. It's this unidimensional kind of bipolar scale or kind of construct where people are kind of motivated either morally bad or morally good. It's kind of unclear what people mean by that. When people do kind of attach labels, they either say people tend to avoid the bad and approach the morally good, or that they ought to approach the good and avoid the morally bad. But I think we know just intuitively that's not the case, that's not the scope and the scale of moral motivation. And we could see in real life that's not the case. People certainly don't just adhere to those things that we ought to do. I'm going to briefly describe kind of what I'm thinking about motivation. Motivation is a subjective experience of feeling drawn towards or away from a specific action, and that motivations for action and inaction can be intrinsic to do the act for its own sake or instrumental in pursuing some further goal. And we're saying that motivations count as moral motivations, not when the motivations themselves are inherently or objectively morally good or bad, but when the agent or the observer sees the action or inaction as morally good or bad. So we developed this unifying framework of moral motivation, and here's some kind of parts of it. I'm not going to read it too much. The most important part is that we think that there's 4 primary moral motivations that arise from there being moral good and moral badness being distinct, and an approach and avoidance tension between both of those. And that results in 4 primary moral motivations that we think can compete with one another. And here they are. There's approaching good, which is the motivation that's directed towards being or behaving in a way that the agent deems as morally good. Avoiding good, which is just the opposite, directed away from being or behaving in a way that's deemed as morally good. And then you have the same for bad, right? Motivation that's directed towards being or behaving in a way that the agent deems as morally bad, and then avoiding that as well. So 4 primary motivations: approaching good, approaching bad, avoiding bad. So what we did was this quick and dirty 2-person pilot or kind of case study to kind of look at this in real world moral dilemmas, to see if these things are represented and how people talk about the dilemmas that they face, instead of the more hypothetical ones like the trolley problem, or they come into your village, do you suffocate your baby so you don't get caught, right? Kind of those things that the field has used a lot. So we used pre-existing real-life moral dilemmas that were collected by, and this is a working paper by Deborah Cesarini. I believe she's in the audience, with Walter and some other people in the lab, some other people at different schools. They've collected this rich data set that they're going to put out soon, so be on the lookout for that, with these real-world moral dilemmas, 344 of them. And in a different study, they've been normed for the rightness, the wrongness, praiseworthiness, blameworthiness, which moral foundations people think are relevant or part of each dilemma, and kind of how realistic it is. So we use that. Here's just an example of the first one in the data set. It's about this person when they were young. They saw a wallet left on top of like an ATM or machine at an arcade, and they knew they shouldn't take it, but they ended up taking the money out of the wallet and threw the wallet out, right? So that's just an example of kind of some of the real world dilemmas that people faced and reported in this data set. So what we had were 2 raters, and they went through all 344 of them, so quite a laborious task. And they had to identify, just a binary, present or not, if each of those 4 moral motivations that I introduced you to were present in each of the moral dilemmas. And then they identified which sentence or sentences corresponded to each identified moral motivation. And then they themselves judged whether they thought the action the agent ultimately took in the dilemma was morally good or bad. Again, I said this is quick and dirty at the beginning of the project. So what we're going to focus on right now is just kind of the relationships that are with the presence or absence of each of the 4 moral motivations. So across all 344 moral motivations, we wanted to see kind of just, are they present? Do people identify these things? And you could see that for both coders, both raters, all 4 of these moral motivations were identified. There is some disagreement with the approach good and avoid bad, although the avoid good and approach bad are fairly similar, given that they're 2 different people, and there's some noise, obviously. It's unclear with just 2 people at this point if the asymmetry between the approach good and avoid bad is due to them being hard conceptually to distinguish, or in line with kind of some of Josh Knobe's ongoing work right now, if people just have conflicting intuitions, right? If people just kind of have intuitions that don't line up with other people about it. But kind of for a first pass, it seems like all 4 of these things are recognized in real world dilemmas. Like that's what I said about those 2. And then we want to know, are moral motivations associated with one another? Are they dependent? Are they independent? Do they tend to appear with one another or not? And I'm just going to direct your attention here. So across the board, there's all positive co-occurrence with all of the pairs. But the yellow arrow that I'm directing you to is when it's an approach bad with an avoid good. So I'd call that the antisocial pair, right? So those tend to be strongly kind of co-occurring. And then what I call the pro-social pair, which is the avoid bad and approach good. They both seem to be kind of higher on the higher end of co-occurring. So they're not fully dependent. They're not fully independent. There seems to be some sort of relationship that we need to tease out further. But there does seem to be some non-randomness for how these things co-occur. Let's see. What was I looking at with this one? Let's see. Approach bad. I don't remember, but let's see if I can figure it out in 10 seconds quick. Approach bad. Avoid bad. So what I was pointing at here is that for person A, it seems like, if they're kind of mutually exclusive, right? If you avoid good, you can't also approach good. It's not quite 0, but it's on the lower end. But for person B, they appear to not be mutually exclusive, right? You could both approach good and avoid good in the same kind of dilemma and experience both these motivations, and same with approaching bad and this motivation to avoid bad, right? So they seem to not be mutually exclusive. They seem to be distinct, and the presence of one doesn't inherently mean that there's the absence of the other, because they're just kind of different conceptualizations of the same thing. They appear to be unique, distinct, but there's variance with just 2 people. Who knows how noisy that is between kind of how people think that relationship works. Then we looked quickly at kind of the moral motivations and how they're associated with different moral foundations. And I'll just leave this up here so you can get a quick glance, but kind of across the board, it seems to be when we try to predict whether the motivation is present, we use the norm data for whether there was endorsement or recognition of the moral foundation. So the moral foundation was the independent variable, and the moral motivation present was the DV. And you can see that there's some strong relationships across the board with odd ratios, and certain different motivations have different patterns with different moral foundations being identified in the moral dilemmas. And then, does the presence of moral motivations predict judgments? We just have person A here. I thought that I saved the updated slide that had both people here, but between traveling back to North Carolina, classes, and networking, which is business speak for drinking at the bar, it seems that I forgot to save the updated slides. But the patterns are similar with person B as well. And you can see we used motivation present here as the independent variable, in the judgment, the normed judgment, as the DV. And whether or not motivations, these specific motivations, are present or absent, do seem to predict significant variation and variance in whether the act was judged as right, wrong, praiseworthy, blameworthy. So there does seem to be some initial first pass evidence that these motivations exist. People recognize them in the dilemmas. There's some sort of co-occurrence that seems to be non-random, and that these things have unique associations with moral foundations, and that they meaningfully predict kind of the judgments that people ascribe. Very quickly, because I just hit 10 minutes. Our next phase is we're going to kind of do the same thing, but we're going to do a suite of LLMs and a bunch of human participants where they're going to go through and do the same thing, right? Because this is just pilot data. We want to see if this replicates. We want to compare it to LLMs, see if the current state of AI could kind of capture these things as well. And then last slide, I just wanted to thank MPRG for the opportunity. Thank you all for being here and listening. I also want to thank Thomas for the incredible amount of work that he put into making sure this runs smoothly. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Oh, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker will be Brianna Nguyen. She is a post-bac researcher here at Duke, and her talk is, as you can see, entitled The Partisan Penalty, How Partisanship Shapes Evaluations of Political Reasons. Brianna, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna, and I'm a postbac researcher at Duke. And I'm going to be presenting a project that I did with Mandy and Walter at Duke and also Samuel Murray at Providence College. I'm going to be presenting the partisan penalty, which describes how partisanship shapes evaluations of political reasons. So I'm just going to jump right in. We Americans are facing a problem in that we are becoming increasingly politically polarized, both in our ideological views, so our policy views, and also effectively polarized, so our feelings towards political opponents. Many people are trying to solve this problem by targeting the misunderstanding of what the other side believes. And they're proposing that we should emphasize empathy and perspective taking in order to better understand what the other side believes. But these approaches often overlook the step that happens before. You can implement these strategies, which is understanding why the other side believes what they do. And so the research question that we're wanting to address today is, does partisan identity influence reason evaluation? And to be more clear, does partisan identity influence the evaluation of reasons as to why someone believes what they do? So we ran 4 experiments with the same task structure. So I'll just take everyone through that now. First, people answered a series of questions as to whether they agree or disagree with these political statements. We gave them a list of 10 statements. 5 of the statements were Democrat aligned, so Democrats tend to agree with them more than Republicans do, and 5 of them were Republican aligned, so Republicans tend to agree with them more than Democrats do. They indicated whether they agree or disagree, and then we move them on to the next part of the task. For the next part, we showed them reasons that correspond with these statements, and there are some things that varied across conditions, so I will explain those. One thing that varied across condition was whether people saw reasons for the same side or the other side. So if people were in the same side condition, let's say that they agreed with this government crime statement, they would have seen other reasons to agree. And if they disagreed with this government crime statement, they would have seen reasons to disagree. And for people in the other side condition, if they said they agree, they would have seen reasons to disagree. And I hope you all get it. It's just, they just see reasons for the other side. One other thing that varied across conditions was whether or not we give the source label. So if you see here boxed in red, for this reason, we said it was given by a Republican, but so if you were in the labeled condition or the experimental condition, you would have seen the source label, and if you're in the control condition, the unlabeled condition, you would have just seen like, this is a reason for the statement. These reasons were collected from a previous study where we just asked people, like, why do you agree or disagree? And so after reading the reason, people were just asked, to what extent is this a good or bad reason to, and then whatever the statement was. And here are the results of this study, and I will go through this plot since there's a lot going on. So on the left-hand side are the Democratic topics. As I mentioned before, we had 5 topics where Democrats tended to agree more than Republicans. And so this top left box here represents reasons given by Democrats for these Democrat topics. And similarly, on the right-hand side, that box represents reasons given by Republicans for Republican topics. And this first row that I'm showing here, I've hidden the other ones because I will reveal them later, but this first row is the control. So this is the unlabeled version. These people, the participants saw the reasons without a source label. The response is from 0 to 100, how good of a reason it was to agree or disagree with the statement. And then these x-axis ticks here represent the partisan identity of the rater and also what condition they were in. So this first group here, the Democrat same side, the rater was a Democrat and they viewed reasons for position that they agree with. So this contrast that we observe between ideologically aligned people is what we're calling the partisan penalty. And what I mean by ideologically aligned is that the first 2 groups in this x-axis here, Democrats same side and Republicans same side, these are both groups that agree with the reason giver. And these people in particular viewed Democratic topics. And so if they agreed with the reason giver, they also agree with each other. And therefore they're ideologically aligned. However, we're seeing that the Democrats who rate these reasons are rating them significantly higher in quality than Republicans rating these same exact reasons. We're observing this ideologically aligned but different reason pattern across all of the different groups here. So Democrat other side, Republican other side, for the second shaded group here, and then same for the Republican topics. And at first glance, this might be like an unsurprising result. Of course, Democrats and Republicans review reasons given by the other side as different. But recall that we didn't give people the labels in this condition. We didn't say this person's a Republican, we just said this is the reason. And so maybe the easy answer would be, oh, people are just guessing the reason, maybe with a little bit of uncertainty because you're not exactly sure what party someone is based on their reason. So that's why we thought, okay, if we give the label, maybe that'll magnify the effect because one, people are less uncertain about the party that they're guessing, and two, it allows people to like project their political polarization on that. But what we find is that when you add the label, this partisan penalty is still present. The actual difference between the two groups is not significantly different across conditions, and except for this one condition where they weren't significant. And so what can we say from this result? There is a partisan penalty for all but one of these conditions. It is not affected by the presence of a source label. So adding on the whether or not this reason is given by a Democrat or Republican didn't change the contrast between these two groups. And this effect is inconsistently affected by different factors like partisan strength, so how strongly you identify with your political party. It's not explained by your anger towards people with opposing political positions. It's not explained by your level of understanding of political opponents. It's also not explained by out-party warmth. And so what are our takeaways from this? We figure that if these factors don't explain the partisan penalty, one option is that we missed a factor, and that's totally possible. And the other option is that this effect must be driven by the content of the reasons themselves, so the wording or something in the reasons. But when we ran natural language processing, we found no difference in the reading scores, the sentiment intensity. And when we tried to predict the partisan identity of the reason giver with the reasons themselves, it did no better than chance. So we're not finding a linguistic difference between the reasons that could be driving this effect. So one thing we want to try in the future is manipulating maybe certain partisan word choices within these reasons. Maybe that'll affect this partisan penalty. And we're super open to anyone's ideas in terms of what the next steps are. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Brianna. Our next speaker is Marcus Trenfield. He's a fourth-year PhD student at Boston College, and his talk is entitled Charity or Solidarity, How Donor Motives Shape Perceptions. Marcus, take it away.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me and see my slides okay? Perfect.
Yes.
So you've likely received mailers, emails, or ads from charities that look like this. Children need a champion like you, protect the future of nature. You can put a present under someone's tree today and a roof over someone's head tomorrow. Unifying these appeals for donations is an underlying theme. Go above and beyond because you have the unique capacity to alleviate this hardship. But increasingly, organizations like mutual aid groups are making a different kind of appeal with messages like give because we have an obligation to care for each other, redistribute your wealth, and mutual aid is solidarity, not charity. The theme underlying these messages is very different. Give because you are obligated. You have a moral obligation to, and you're likely rectifying structural inequities you've benefited from. So what we see here is two distinct appeals. Donate because it's the generous thing to do, or donate because it's the just thing to do. And some organizations even make this contrast explicit. For example, the community center Rosie's Place states, charity is giving to others what belongs to you, justice is giving others what belongs to them. And so this broader contrast inspired us to study how people perceive donors motivated by generosity or justice. So prior work shows that these virtues can shape perceptions. So in our lab, we've asked people to share the most generous and just acts they can imagine. So for example, donating a kidney or whistleblowing. And when others rated actors engaging in these behaviors, the generous actors were seen as more moral, and the just actors were seen as more values-driven. By design, these were very different behaviors. So it remains unclear how these virtues shape perceptions of the same behavior, like donating. Which led to our core question: how do people perceive generosity and justice-motivated donors who make identical donations? To answer this, We introduced participants to two donors, Will and John. We told them that each donor made a $100 donation to a local organization. They're motivated to donate in accordance with their value of generosity or justice. We randomized which donor participants saw first, or rather on top, and the pairing of names and motives. Afterwards, we asked participants to judge both donors along 3 dimensions. First, perceptions of their character. And so here we measured 3 outcomes, the donor's moral goodness, the donor's warmth, and the donor's competence. And we found that people saw generosity motivated donors as very moral and actually more moral than justice motivated donors. They were also judged as more warm, but people saw justice motivated donors as more competent. The second set of outcomes we measured were perceptions of the donation itself. Specifically, how quick did they think this donor was to give, and how emotion driven were they? And we saw that people saw generosity motivated donors as quicker to give and more driven by emotion. And the last dimension we measured was the donor's intentions. We focused on 2 intentions in particular, a pro-social intention to inspire others to care and act on this cause, and a self-serving intention to improve one's reputation. And we found that the justice-motivated donor was seen as having a stronger intention to inspire others to give, and found no differences in perceptions that the donor intended to improve their reputation. So to recap, we found that even when they're making the same donation, generous donors are judged as more moral, warm, quick to donate, and emotion-driven. Conversely, justice-motivated donors are judged as more competent and more intent on inspiring others to give, and we see no difference in donors' intentions to improve their reputation. And we found these same pattern of effects for participants who think that both donors are giving to the same organization, so truly identical gifts, when we use more naturalistic language. And we've shown that it's not driven by perceived differences in political orientation of the donor or the organization. But of course, as often as we learn about a donation from a trusted source, we learn about it from the donor themselves. And previous work shows that when people broadcast their prosociality, we often see it in one of 2 ways: a praiseworthy act of raising awareness, or a selfish act of trying to improve their reputation. So we wanted to explore if and how donors sharing about their own virtue motive influences how these motives shape perceptions. To answer this, we used a similar methodology, but instead had donors' gifts and virtue motives shared on a donor wall, similar to something you might see on GoFundMe. We then measured the same outcomes and found a large reversal in our findings. So when sharing their own virtue motives, the justice-motivated donor is now seen as more moral, more competent, more emotion-driven, and more intending to inspire others to give, and also less intending to improve their reputation compared to the generous donor. And we see no differences in warmth or decision speed. So to recap, when we stipulated donors' motives, the generosity-motivated donor was generally esteemed more than the justice-motivated donor. When we had donors share their own motive, this flips. So we were curious, what is driving this effect? Is it that justice motive is particularly praiseworthy when it's communicated, or does the generosity motive lose its sheen in the public? So to answer this, we randomly assign people to see one of our 2 earlier designs. So either donor motives stipulated by us, the experimenters, or shared by the donors themselves. And we not only replicate our findings for when the motive is stipulated, but also when it's shared by the donors. And when we compare these 2 sources of motive information, we learn 2 things. First, donors are generally discounted for sharing their giving and motive publicly. So both generous and just donors were seen as less moral, warm, competent, and more intent on improving their reputation when they shared their own motive. But this discounting is worse for generosity-motivated donors. So across moral goodness, warmth, competence, emotion, and reputation signaling, the generosity-motivated donor experienced a greater loss in praise for sharing their motive publicly. So in summary, these studies show that virtues shape perceptions of donors, character, donations, and their intentions, and that virtue motives shape how or what public discounting looks like for donors. In particular, generosity-motivated donors are more heavily discounted. And We have a theory as to why we find these effects. We think it's because of the distinct social functions of these virtues. So prior work suggests that the evolutionary function of generous behavior is to signal a willingness to cooperate. And morality as cooperation theory would suggest that this association between generosity and cooperation should drive people to see, as we find, generous or generosity motivated donors as more moral. Uh, but beyond that, we see people rate these donors higher on other traits that other work shows people associate with especially cooperative people. So warmth, uh, quickness to help, and being emotion driven. Conversely, people may see a justice motive as a signal of one's commitment to impartiality. And therefore, they might see them similar to other impartial actors like utilitarians and effective altruists. So very competent, but less warm and less moral. Um, and taking a step back, or rather, because people recognize the social value in these, the difference in the social value in these two virtues, specifically that we value generosity more, when the authenticity of a virtue motive is unclear, people will likely approach a generosity motive with more suspicion than a justice motive and withhold praise since there's more to gain from faking a generosity motive. Um, so more broadly, while much of the existing research on perceptions of prosocial behavior describes prosocial motivations in broad strokes, using phrases like doing the right thing or acting authentically, this work suggests that we should attend to how virtue ethics highlight the amount of meaningful diversity in prosocial motivations. Because the present work shows that these different virtues lead people to make different judgments in response to the same prosocial behavior and suggests that future work should more granularly examine what people see as a pro-social motivation. And finally, this work also has practical implications. Increasing research demonstrates both the benefit of donors sharing about their giving as a way to inspire others to give, and the main hurdle to this, social consequences the donor might experience for sharing their giving. This research suggests that we should advise donors and organizations to adopt the justice frame for their giving because it's not only less socially costly, but more socially impactful for the cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. With that, we've come to the end of our data blitz. So I wanted to thank all of our blitzers. Your talks were fantastic, as well as Thomas and the other organizers for helping make this happen. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks to everybody. It's always exciting to see what the next generation of researchers are working on. I think the field is in very good hands, so it was great to hear about everyone's research. I saw there was some back and forth in the chat. I imagine some of the speakers found quite helpful. So if you have comments or suggestions, please feel free, like I said, either to add them to the chat or you can either send them to them in a direct message. That said, let's take a couple minute break, maybe a 5 minute break. I need to refill my coffee, and then I'll introduce Professor Dimery Cotton. Okay, thanks. We'll say 5 minutes. I'm going to set my timer. See you soon. Okay. I'll wait a couple seconds, let everyone trickle back in from their kitchens. Mm, I forced everyone to take a break to support my caffeine addiction, but
I do the same. Seems perfectly sensible to me.
okay. Well, let's get started. So next up is Professor Demery Cotton. So Joanna Demery Cotton is a senior research fellow and director of the Philosophical Moral Psychology Lab at the Hero Oxford Institute at Oxford University. She's also a Hugh Price Fellow in Philosophy and Psychology at Jesus College and an honorary member of the Department of Experimental Psychology. Her research uses interdisciplinary methods from analytic philosophy and empirical psychology to investigate the psychological underpinnings of moral judgments, moral concepts, and moral agency, and explores implications of empirical studies for normative implications in philosophical ethics. So another one of these cases where I love the interdisciplinarity of her work and that it has a kind of practical policy focus in many cases. Recently, she's been working on projects on the full concept of valid consent, attributions of moral agency and responsibility, and obligations to respect the wishes of the dead, which is the fascinating topic she'll be discussing with us today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Demery Cotton.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and for the invitation. It's a real honor to have the opportunity to present my work. It's such a wonderful group. I've so enjoyed the talks so far today and yesterday. And so it's a real honor to be sharing my work with you. So let me, um, okay, you should be able to see my slides. Maybe Thomas can give me a little nod.
Yes.
If so, excellent. Thank you. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about a new project, thinking about the moral duties that we have to the dead that I've been working on with my collaborators, Matthew Lindauer at Brooklyn College and City University, New York, and my colleague here at the Hero Oxford Institute, Cesar Palacios Gonzalez. Okay, so when we think about moral duties, who do we have moral duties to? Well, we've seen a bunch of research about this question. Some of the research presented today, some of the research presented yesterday that looks at the different kinds of humans that we have moral duties to. So to whom do we expand our notion of morality? Which types of humans do we extend it to, but also which types of creatures, whether that be animals, whether that even be non-animal creatures such as natural beings, nature, plants, the environment. Very recently, this group of researchers has been looking at how and whether and who extends moral duties to future people, so future generations, and how far into the future. But one really big topic that we felt had been really understudied was whether we extend moral duties to the dead, those who are no longer with us. And in some ways, it's kind of puzzling that we haven't, as moral psychologists, spent more time on this, given what a prominent place this has in contemporary culture, and our social interactions and our legal system. So in many, many jurisdictions, including in the West, in the UK where I am now, in the US where many of you are, a huge amount of legal weight is given to what the dead say they wished for their property, for their bodies. For various hopes and dreams that they might have had. This is legally protected, so there are huge institutions that invest huge amounts of money into ensuring that certain kinds of legally protected wishes are carried out, namely those specified in things like wills and trusts. But it seems like we've got all kinds of other non-legally binding practices that seem to surround respecting or fulfilling, the wishes of the dead. So we consider what to do with someone's organs when they've died and whether to donate them or not, depending on whether they've expressed wishes to be an organ donor. We decide on funeral arrangements, sometimes based in part, for example, on whether, grandma said she wanted to be cremated or buried, and families can actually get into conflict if they disagree about what the wishes of family members are. And we seem to have conflicts about what to do with The artworks produced by celebrities who are dead based on what they wanted with that work. And so you get these kind of famous, fun cases. So there's the case of Charles Dickens here in the UK, so famous 19th century author. So extremely famous, but there was no statue of him erected in the UK until 2014 because he wrote in a letter just before he died that he wanted his works to be the only testament um, to his life and the only thing by which he was remembered, and he despised monuments. And so when the town of Portsmouth, where he's from, actually put up a statue of him in 2014, some people, like the Charles Dickens Society or feds or whatever it was, were really upset about this because this went against his wishes. Okay. So what we wanted to do in this research is to start exploring this question of moral duties to the dead. And lots of philosophers have written about this, particularly over the last 50 years. There's been a growing literature on it, but most of this literature presumes that it really is part of common sense morality, that there are moral duties to the dead. And we really wanted to start investigating this empirically and then also ask what explains these moral judgments if people do make moral judgments that there are moral duties to the dead. So I'm going to talk about the 3 studies that we've done so far. They used similar methods. They were all pre-registered studies. So in total, we have 1,800 participants. These were all studies with samples collected on Prolific with participants who were based in the UK. And the demographics across our different studies are fairly similar. So they're gender balanced samples, and they're slight majority atheists, and then another large minority Christian that reflects the demographics of the UK population more generally. And these studies are between subjects. Okay, so our 2 big picture hypotheses going into this for the very first time was one just about moral judgment. So we thought that actually going against the wishes of the dead would be widely regarded as wrong. Secondly, we were really curious about what the impact of time would be. And we thought that perhaps it's not the case that we care about the duties towards all dead people equally. Maybe the duty to respect someone's wishes fades over time and becomes less stringent the longer they have been dead. Okay, so the design of our very first study on this, we started with a sample of 600 participants and excluded some based on attention and comprehension checks. And the participants were assigned to read one of 4 different scenarios. All the scenarios concerned a wish that someone had. So the protagonist either expressed a wish with regards to a painting that she owned and to whom she wanted it to be given, or whether she wanted a kidney to be donated to science or not, or where she wanted money of hers to go, or whether or not she was okay with her private correspondence being made public. And participants received one of these scenarios, and they received one of 3 possible versions of these scenarios. So we're calling this time. In some of these cases, that person is alive as they're at the time. In another condition, this person actually died yesterday. And in another possible condition, that person died 100 years ago. So just to give you an idea of the vignettes the participants were given, I'm going to show you the example for the painting condition. The others were similar, but concerned substantively different types of wish. So this is in the condition where Jane is, the protagonist is alive. So Jane is a person who grew up in San Francisco and lives alone there as an adult. She used to own a valuable painting of the Danube River, but she decided to give it to her family. She told her family that her only wish was that if they didn't want to keep it, she really wanted it to be donated to the San Francisco Public Library, a place very close to her heart. Her family members are in possession of the painting, know about Jane's wishes, and don't want to keep it. So participants who were in the conditions in which Jane had died read the identical vignette, but we just manipulated this bit right at the beginning that specified the time frame. So it started, Jane died yesterday, and Jane was a person, and all the other details were the same. Or they saw a version which said that Jane died 100 years ago, and the rest of the scenario continued as before. So how did we measure moral judgments? We used 3 different measures of moral judgment. Firstly, we asked participants how important it was for Jane's family to respect her wishes. We phrased it according to whatever the wish was corresponding to the scenario. We asked participants to rate how blameworthy the family would be if they disrespected the wish. And we asked participants whether they agreed that they would be disgusted with the family if they went against the wish. And these different moral judgments showed really high internal reliability. So in this study and for all the studies, we simply took a mean of participants' ratings so that higher ratings essentially indicate putting greater weight on the idea that there's a moral duty to respect the wish, and lower ratings indicate not agreeing that there is a moral duty to respect the wish. Okay, so now I'm just going to show you the results from this first study. So on the left, you're just going to see the mean moral judgments depending on whether Jane was alive, died yesterday, or died 100 years ago, the column on the right. So when Jane was alive, participants overwhelmingly tended to judge that there was a duty to respect her wish. On the right, you're just seeing the distribution of responses. So you can see the modal response is its ceiling. So it's an average score of 7 is the modal response. But what about when Jane was dead? How did it differ in that case? The answer was it didn't differ very much at all. So when Jane died yesterday, participants seemed to place just as great a moral importance on respecting Jane's wish. And even when Jane had died 100 years ago, they thought there was a slightly less stringent duty maybe to respect her wish, but not by very much. As you can see, we still have a mean above 5 on a 7-point scale, and the modal response is actually 6 if you look at the distribution there, bottom right. Okay, so in the next study, we wanted to look at cases where there are trade-offs to fulfilling someone's wish. And one of the reasons we wanted to do that was methodological. So we wanted to make sure, well, were these true moral judgments that we were measuring in the first study, or were people just agreeing that there was a moral duty because it just seemed like the right or easy answer in a scenario where there was nothing really at stake in saying so? And in fact, in real life, as some philosophers have pointed out, the interests of the living and the dead often conflict. So often, doing whatever someone who has died wished might take resources, might be inconvenient, and might also just not be optimal. Resources could be better directed depending on the interests of the living. And indeed, some philosophers think that this is normatively incorrect, but a number of philosophers have argued that actually, yes, the dead's wishes do give us moral reasons that are sufficiently weighty to outweigh at least some considerations that the living have. Okay, so we ran another study. So in this study, again, participants were allocated to scenario. I'm not going to go through the whole wording of the scenario, but all participants read the same beginning to the story. In this case, Jane wants the family to donate $500,000 of her money to this library, but participants read that there was a catch, and for this reason, the family are considering sending the money elsewhere. And so we manipulated again whether Jane was alive, died yesterday, died 100 years ago. And we also crucially manipulated the kind of catch there was. So it was either inconvenient to fulfill this wish, or it was actually immoral in some way to fulfill this wish. And we manipulated the size of this trade-off. So when it was inconvenient to fulfill the wish, the family had to either do a 1-hour online course in order to be able to donate this money in this way for some annoying bureaucratic reason, or they would have to actually undertake a 1-month-long in-person financial course in the big trade-off condition. In the immoral condition, and the small moral trade-off condition, the library in question has loose ties to a kind of unpleasant local political family. And in the big moral trade-off condition, the library is described as funneling money directly to sort of abhorrent, racist local political causes. And we measured moral judgments in much the same way as we did in study 1. Okay, so to the results. So here what you're seeing is just the finding that much like in study 1, participants when Jane is alive tend to say, yes, you have a moral obligation to fulfill her wish on average. And again, just like in study 1, this changes very little depending on whether she's dead. There's no difference at all when she died yesterday, and only a very slight reduction in moral judgments when she died 100 years ago. But what's really crucial for this study is looking at whether trade-offs really affect this relationship. So here you can see when there's, oh, so sorry, this is not yeah, so across the top, we have cases where there was a convenience-based trade-off, and on the left here, we're seeing the case where there was just a small convenience-based trade-off. Still, we don't, introducing a small trade-off like this doesn't reduce the extent to which it's equally immoral to go against the wishes of Jane when she has died. But then the question is maybe a big trade-off leads people to really strongly discount, especially the wishes of Jane when she's dead. And that's just not what we find. Even, oh, sorry, this is the case where the trade-off is a moral trade-off. Similarly, there's just so people tend to think that there's a slightly less stringent obligation to fulfill an immoral wish, but that's just a fact about duties to fulfill wishes. That's nothing to do with whether Jane is alive or dead. Similarly, if the trade-off is a big one, we see a main effect. So there's overall less of a strong duty to fulfill Jane's wish, but still, it doesn't matter whether she's alive or dead, or it matters very little. They're still viewing the family's obligated to fulfill her wish. And the same is true when there's a big moral trade-off. The family is seen as less obliged to fulfill this trade-off, but that's irrespective of whether Jane's dead or not. Okay, so then in our third study, we wanted to move on to ask, well, what grounds the duties of the dead? So we have this quote from Aristotle. So a dead man is popularly believed to be capable of experiencing both good and ill fortune. Okay, so this reflects where most of the philosophical literature of the past 40, 50 years has really focused. This idea that posthumous events can affect one's welfare. So one of the defenders of this idea is Joel Feinberg, and here he uses this nice thought experiment. Suppose that after my death, an enemy cleverly forges documents to prove that I was a philanderer, an adulterer, and a plagiarist. Can there be any doubt that I've been harmed by such libels? Okay. Feinberg's view, amongst a family of views in the literature, can be described as welfarist views. So these philosophical accounts argue that the reason that we should respect the wishes of the dead is because the dead are capable of experiencing posthumous harm, and this posthumous harm, not experienced in a literal sense, but that there is such a thing as posthumous harm, and that explains why we have a duty to not go against their wishes. Naturally, there's a bunch of research in psychological theories that, if insofar as the dead are perceived to be harmed, we should predict that could ground moral judgments, that we have duties to fulfill their wishes. So in this study, we really wanted to look at are harm or welfare-based considerations driving these moral judgments, or are some other moral considerations really doing the work here? And I'll talk about in a second what kinds of other moral considerations we looked at. So the design of the study was very similar to study one. So participants were allocated to one of several possible scenarios describing a wish. They saw only one condition, so the protagonist was either alive or died at a certain time frame. The only slight difference in study one is that in all cases, we specified vaguely that it was difficult but not impossible to fulfill the wish. We wanted to ensure that the judgments were not just trivial to make. Okay, we measured judgments again very similarly to the first two studies, except that we removed the word respect from the wording of the items because we didn't want to bias responders to respect-based moral values over, say, harm-based moral values. After participants gave their moral judgments about whether the family were obligated to fulfill Jane's wish, we then used a number of measures to assess possible values that might ground these moral judgments. And I'll go through what these were in a second, but in a random order, participants answered a forced choice question, and then they answered a bunch of scale variables, and I'll go through those momentarily. And then finally, we assessed a number of individual differences, and I'll go through those in a moment. Okay, so these are the main results. This is just what I've shown you every time, pretty much. So overall, participants tend to judge that there is a moral obligation to fulfill the wishes of the dead in much the same way that there is a moral obligation to fulfill someone's wishes while they're alive. Here, actually, even when they've been dead 100 years, the reduction in moral judgments here didn't reach significance. Okay, but then what we really want to know is what drives those moral judgments. So participants were asked to a four-choice question between considerations of harm and considerations of respect. So going against Jane's wishes is wrong because it harms Jane, or going against Jane's wishes is wrong because it's disrespectful. Even when Jane's alive, it turns out participants overwhelmingly preferred a respect-based explanation over a harm-based explanation. And this preference went to ceiling when Jane was dead. So participants were unanimous in selecting a respect-based explanation. Okay, but that's a forced choice. So we also just wanted to um, assess participants' judgments some more freely. So we asked participants what impact they thought going against Jane's wishes would have, and they saw a number of statements presented in a random order. Some of these were related to Jane's welfare. So going against Jane's wishes would cause Jane pain, cause Jane to suffer, impact Jane's happiness. Participants rated the extent to which they agreed. Now, we're also sensitive to the fact that a number of these philosophers think that the dead are harmed, but in ways that aren't captured by things like experiential concepts like pain and suffering, and perhaps even non-happiness, but more because of the interference in their interests or their projects. So we also asked participants whether going against her wishes would restrict her liberty or make her life less meaningful. We also asked about third-party welfare. So many of the reasons you might have to fulfill the wishes of the dead is just to make other people happy, to stop other people from suffering. So to maintain trust in other people, to not cause yourself anxiety about whether your wishes will be respected and this kind of thing. And then we also asked about some other values. So we asked whether it would be disrespectful to Jane, whether it would show a lack of loyalty, and we had an item that was tapping into moral character. So would it make you more likely to behave badly in other ways? And what we found, in short, was that judgments about disrespect and disloyalty showed a very similar pattern to moral judgments. So just like the moral judgments, participants thought irrespective of whether Jane was alive or dead, it was very disrespectful to go against her wishes, and it would also be very disloyal. Participants, however, did not think that going against wishes would be harmful to Jane, particularly when she was dead, although somewhat harmful when she was alive. Participants did tended to judge that going against her wishes would be harmful to third parties like society, like friends and family. But they overwhelmingly tended to reject the notion that going against her wishes would restrict her liberty or would make her life less meaningful. Okay, so we put together a linear regression to see which of those judgments actually predicted moral evaluations of the duty to respect the wishes. And the main thing to note is that considerations of welfare, like judgments that it would be harmful to Jane or liberty, or that it would undermine the meaningfulness of her life, did not predict judgments about the duty to fulfill her wish when she was alive. And that was the same when she was dead. So none of these conditions were those predictive. The main consistent predictor of moral judgments were the idea that it would be disrespectful to go against her wishes and the idea that it would be disloyal. We also collected participants' answers to the moral foundation questionnaire. So there's a lot here I can talk about. Just really quickly, the main thing I'll just draw your attention to was that moral foundation scores in general were really not very predictive of moral judgments. In these cases, they didn't do it. They were significantly predictive, but they explained very little variance. And the only foundation that significantly predicted moral judgments were judgments on the in-group loyalty foundation. And then finally, we collected participants' perceptions of agreement with dualism using a validated dualism scale. So these are items like my consciousness will survive the disintegration of my body. We also gave participants who were in the dead condition the postmortem mind perception scale, which was something developed by Doyle and Gray. So these are items like in some way Jane still has emotions and feelings. And we also, again, measured religiosity. Unsurprisingly, okay, when Jane is alive, none of these metaphysical commitments predict moral judgments. That's unsurprising. But a very similar story emerges when Jane is dead. There's some significant association between belief in dualism and postmortem mind perception. and the belief that it would be wrong to go against Jane's wishes. But again, this is, oh, sorry, this is explaining very little variance. And if I can just draw your attention to the bottom left quadrant, you can see that actually overwhelmingly in the sample, the vast majority of participants disagree in allocating mind perception to the agent after they have died. Okay, so in conclusion, we think that these initial studies into this suggest that it really is part of common sense secular morality, at least in the UK, that there are pretty robust duties to respect the wishes of the dead. We think that this judgment is not based on welfare concerns, nor is it based on metaphysical commitments or religious belief. And we think it's time to start exploring alternative ethical accounts to all the focus that has been going on in this literature on posthumous harm. And so to the extent that we are aiming to capture common sense morality. And we think that two values that would be particularly worth exploring further are values of disrespect and values of loyalty. And of course, we need to do a lot more research. And we're especially interested in extending this work to looking at non-familial sort of duties to the dead who are not related to you, who maybe have different relationships to you, who are even strangers to you. Okay, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joanna. That was great. I have some questions, but I'll wait and see what everyone else wants to do first. Give me one sec. If you want to unshare your screen,
Yeah.
I will.
There we go.
So, give me one sec here to change up the view. Okay, so now we're in gallery mode. Do you want me to field questions, or do you want to just call them out as people raise their hands?
I'm happy to call on
Okay.
people, but intervene if I'm doing a terrible job.
You know, it's okay. Fair enough. Well, then I will go first since no one else is asking their question. I'm going to focus just on the disrespect thing because there's something that I find this very interesting. And I think there's a puzzle that you find, we'll say like equality of moral obligation despite inequality of like the harm. Harm, even if let's view disrespect itself as a kind of harm, right? So like if I'm alive, I could be disrespected and know it, and that harms me in a particular way. I could be disrespected and not know it, and I don't know that it harms me, but it could be harming me in other ways because people now know that I've been disrespected and I'm a fool. Whereas if I'm dead, the disrespect is literally unknowable, right? And so insofar as you have a differential amount of disrespect that could be done to the alive and the living and the dead, you expect that to somehow be tracked in their decisions about obligation. Does that make sense? Like you'd think that if it's disrespect, I'm even more obligated to do it in the context of someone who's alive because there are harms that go along with disrespecting someone who's alive in obvious ways. And when they're dead, I am disrespecting them, but it's a lesser kind of disrespect because it's unknowable. And so I should find it more permissible, even if still impermissible. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a lot there that's really fascinating. And the short answer is we don't know that much about. So we've collected some judgments. Participants really endorse this idea of disrespect being really important to their judgments here, but we haven't yet unpacked at least what participants are thinking that means and what that means to them. So and also whether how they're thinking about it differs even if sort of the amount it matters to them doesn't differ whether someone's alive or dead, maybe how they're interpreting it and why it matters differs. So one thing I will say is that the way just philosophically we were thinking about disrespect, so we were really interested in the idea that so yes, disrespect can be harmful in various ways, but it seems like disrespect, there's kind of something wrongful about disrespect that's located in the attitude of the disrespecter, and not in the impact it has on others. So you might think, for example, that uttering a slur is disrespectful, even if it's not heard. And that's completely about something to do with the character or the attitudes. Arguably, we could have a debate about that of the person. And so we're wondering whether it's more that kind of concept that people have in mind. I mean, we did, of course, there's always welfare risks with any other that coincide with other value, especially when someone's alive. Right. We tried to control for that by, say, oh, no one will find out, this kind of thing. It's, of course, really hard to actually control. You participant inferences about that kind of thing. We just haven't seen that kind of thing impacting people's judgments. The other just final thing I'll pick up on and what you said that was really interesting was this idea of equality. So respect being owed to everyone. And that's one of the reasons I'm really curious about this idea that maybe respect rather than loyalty could do a lot of explanatory work in cases where we're not talking about duties to fulfill the wishes of your family. So, do you have to be respectful of the wishes of some stranger you just happen to find out? Find out about, and you can do something about it. I feel like maybe we will find people moralizing that kind of situation, and that becomes really hard to account for in terms of loyalty, but is maybe easier to account for in terms of respect, which is a more universalizing kind of moral value, but remains to be seen.
It's super interesting. Thank you.
Charles.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Really enjoyed the talk. I was wondering if the research you've done touched on people's attitudes in two sorts of cases, the two sorts of possibilities. One, take the example of Sandra West, who a millionaire who decreed that on her death she be buried in her 1964 Ferrari. If that had been disregarded, it would seem different from the sort of reputational harm that Feinberg alludes to. In fact, not following her wishes could maybe reduce reputational harm. Reputational harm that would come about seeing her as decadent. Uh, I think you know where I'm going with this. So,
Yeah.
could it be the case? I wonder what people's intuitions would be in a situation like that, where it might reduce harm by not going along with someone's wishes. But then another case, supposing the Venus de Milo, let's say, was privately owned, and someone decreed that on their death it be just ground into powder. There wouldn't be any sort of physical harm to a person, but perhaps some sort of harm or maybe disrespect at a cultural level. Has your research touched on those sorts of dynamics?
We have not, and that sounds really interesting. And so the first idea I think is something that is fascinating to look at. Also, just when people are alive, right? The way I might maybe put that idea is when can we paternalistically interfere with someone's wishes or refuse on paternalistic grounds? So not on the basis that it would be really inconvenient for me to fulfill these wishes, but because I think it would hurt you in some sense. It's bad for you. You shouldn't wish what you're wishing. It gets into really fascinating questions too about when we make judgments about what someone's real wish is. So maybe we think, oh, they've said this crazy thing, but kind of, like deep down, like I think that that's not really what they value or that doesn't represent them very well. Yeah, I think that would be a really fascinating thing to look at. There's actually a really interesting thing in the law that happens that this reminds me of. So I think in the US, there's a really interesting issue of what happens when people's legal trusts become illegal. So if someone's left money to, I don't know, a school that can only admit white kids or something, like these kinds of legal cases have happened. Apparently, how the law works is courts have to figure out what the motive was behind the person's trust and whether their real motive was charity, and so then they can just, continue the trust, but directed, to, not non-racially discriminating educational purposes, or whether their real motive was the racially aggravated one, and in which case they dissolve the trust. So this idea that we have to figure out what someone's real wish is to fulfill it properly. Um, and then of course there are duties to the dead that aren't really about fulfilling people's wishes, but are maybe about commemoration or about cultural respect. And there's lots of different really messy and fascinating moral angles that we haven't looked at yet. But thanks for the question. I think it's really interesting.
Thank you.
I think John.
No, he was telling me to he was telling me to unmute
Oh,
myself.
okay,
Alan.
got it. Alan.
Alan, sorry.
Um, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Um, in the larger historical and cultural context for this, throughout history as far back as we can trace it and around the world to the present day, there are a great many societies in which people perceive their ancestors as involved in their lives and continuing the roles that they had when they were alive. In other words, being the elders who you should show respect to and whose will you should follow and who will protect you, but also will punish you if you do something that violates their will. So, do you have any idea whether your participants maybe they wouldn't have ascribed to this explicitly, but whether there's any indication that implicitly they perceive, elders as actively perceive, continuing to relate to them, and continuing to have legitimate authority.
Fascinating question. So, so you're right that on an explicit level, most of our participants reject this kind of idea. So they both rejected this in measures of religiosity and then also in measures of postmortem mind perception. Like in a sense, this person lives on. In a sense, this person still cares about what's happening. So they do reject statements like that. Um, so I suspect that at least in these samples, participants don't think that there's still meaningful activity, as it were, coming in that direction. But I think what might be really interesting, and it makes me think of Dale Dorsey's philosophical account, which is about the relationship that you have to the person who is dead. And he makes this really interesting point that we can, when someone has died, someone you had a relationship with, like a family relationship with, you're still interacting with them. It's just that the interaction is only on one side of it now. But so like when you spend time remembering,
But you may perceive the other person to be interacting with you, and you may attribute things that are happening to you to their will to make you prosper or to punish you for something. That's your perception, so it's real psychologically speaking.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We haven't, yeah, we don't have data to really assess the extent. I mean, yeah, we haven't found evidence of that yet, but perhaps that is going on, and that's a really interesting suggestion. Now, John.
One of the problems is people don't know their own minds, so they don't know if they're implicitly thinking about, I mean, I don't know if you read Peter Carruthers' The Opacity of Mind, but the point is that people can be thinking all kinds of things and don't know that they are thinking those things, and it's not a Freudian repression. It's just that the reflective, articulate, verbal part of the mind doesn't have access to the rest of the mind. So it's possible that they are thinking about themselves as in a relationship in which their ancestors respond to them and they have duties to their ancestors, and their ancestors will look out for them or punish them, even though, explicitly they would say, are you kidding? No.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really great to extend this research to some other methods as well, other than yeah, explicit judgments. John, did you have a question?
No, ironically, his mic is muted. What comes around goes around, John.
Excited. Okay, now I can go. So, a couple of areas I think it would be great to extend it. We have very strong feelings about corpse desecration. It comes up particularly in military misconduct. But for a less grim case, I was just thinking of That seems a pretty direct test of a respect hypothesis would be, there's a very fine cat behind you. Um, um, for the, testing the respect thing would be don't speak ill of the dead.
Mm.
So here's three conditions. You call me a jerk to my face, you call me a jerk behind my back, and you call me a jerk um, out of my permanent hearing when I'm dead. And it looks like from what my sense of the trend of your data is people would not differentiate those so strongly. It does seem like it's creepy, fine to say gossip about me and say I'm a jerk, but something's supposed to change when I'm dead. And I want you have intuitions about whether people adopt that or not.
Well, actually, when we started this research, I actually wondered whether we'd see that people would place greater moral weight on fulfilling someone's wishes the day after they died for this kind of reason. It's like they've just died. We need to, at least right now, treat
They,
everything they wanted as super important and don't say anything bad about them, but then maybe later it's okay. But then we haven't actually but we haven't done any of the talking ill of thing that you're talking about, and I think that's a really nice suggestion for those um contrasting cases. I think that would be really great to look at. Thank you.
Okay. Well, oh, Alan, do you want to? We've got time. Go ahead.
Well, just an idea that crossed my mind, and then I'll shut up. Suppose I act disrespectfully toward my dead friends or kin. Will that make me think, or of course make other people think, that I didn't love them in the first place, that I didn't really respect them in the first place, that I was not a loyal son or a loyal whatever, does it make me or other people rethink whether I was sincere in my relationship? And even if nobody else finds out about it, I might think, gosh, what kind of loving son are you that you would treat your parents this way after they're dead? Maybe you didn't love them so much after all. By the way, I do love my parents. having used that hypothetical example, I will be an example of the point I'm making, and say,
No, but
I have
actually,
to affirm how much I love my parents.
No, but that's a great example. And actually, so yeah, we don't know. That could be partly driving the effect. So, what kind of character inferences do we make about someone, whether they perform the same behavior against someone else, depending on whether that person's alive or not? Is it less normative in both the statistical and just social sense, right? For someone to go against someone's wishes of a dead family member compared, as
And
opposed to,
does it
if someone's
imply,
alive, yeah.
does it impugn the relationship that you had when they were alive? Does it say, well, you
Right.
acted like you loved this person or were respectful, but we can see that you weren't, because once they can't find out what you're doing, you don't show respect and follow their wishes.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. That's fascinating. Yeah.
John, yeah.
um, it strikes me a lot of this stuff is embedded in ritual contexts, and there might be some pretty interesting variations. So at the wake, when we've had 9 beers, you can speak ill of the dead, but you can't at the viewing, and so on. And you see in many of these things have rich ritual context that it might be interesting to fool around with. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. That seems really right and maybe distinctive. Like that's maybe a place to look for something distinctive. So like one thing we find interesting about this is I guess we got results about what it means to people to respect their wishes in general that maybe were surprising. So for example, that even when someone's alive, it's less about them getting upset or upsetting other people. People just, already just think it's wrong to even consider it. But when people are alive, it's not, and we didn't look at none of the cases we were looking at were embedded in even funerals or anything like that. We didn't include anything like that because we were controlling for things. But really fascinating how this might intersect with the rituals that really are very distinctive when we're talking about the dead. Yeah, that's great. That's great, John.
Well, thank you, Jenna. That was very interesting. I'm going to hand this off real quick to Walter, who's going to introduce Paolo. Give me one sec, guys. I gotta reset these stupid pins. I gotta unpin myself. There we go. All right, Walter, you're up.
So I never know what to do in intros these days because you can just look all this stuff up on the internet. But I'll mention that that Paolo got his undergrad and master's and PhD from the University of Sao Paulo. And now he runs a lab at Mackenzie Presbyterian University, a giant lab filled with extremely friendly people. So please go visit. He's gotten lots of grants. He runs lots of programs, including this upcoming The Future, Rethinking the Future 3, Fostering Social Equality next week, which is going to be online, I think. So another thing to look up and maybe attend if you're so interested. But things you don't find out on the internet is that Paolo is a great photographer, a beautiful singer of karaoke songs, and an amazingly quick writer. Like he wrote this book recently that, in what was it took him like 6 months or something to write the entire book. Uh, but in terms of his talk today, I'll just mention that he's a wonderful person to bring philosophers together with psychology because he raises large questions about leading theories of morality and what exactly morality is. So I'm really looking forward to what Paulo tells us about who cares, a critical test for morality's leading theories.
Okay, thank you very much, Walter and Thomas, for inviting me to this meeting. And about karaoke, I can prove that I'm not good. Walter is the best in karaoke. I can prove I have lots of videos I can share with you during. No, I'm just kidding. I can share during the presentation. I'm just kidding. So thank you very much, Walter, for your kind words, and it's a pleasure to interact with you and have you supervising some of my students and collaborating in research and visiting you at Duke and also receiving you here in Brazil. And it's a pleasure. And thank you again for inviting me. So I will share my screen. Let me see here. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Probably when I put in the presentation mode, I will not see you guys. And just let me know if you are seeing everything correctly. Are you seeing? Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I will start with a
So it's not full screen for me. I don't know if it is for other people.
No.
No. It's more like the presenter view of some sort.
Oh, really? No.
Yeah.
For me too.
Really? Yeah, that's weird. Let me see. Blah, blah, present. Let me know. What now?
Nope. Still not a slideshow.
Oh, really? Oh, sorry.
It's always amazing to me how someone as technically sophisticated and competent as Paolo cannot handle Zoom. But that's not a comment about Paolo. That's a comment about Zoom. Like, why do they make it so hard?
Oh, oh my God. Yeah, come on, I have a PhD and I can't. I'm just kidding. Okay, let me see. Let me see if it works right now. No, not at all. Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed now. Let me do it again. Here, okay. Share. Now you are probably seeing just my screen. I'll put in the presentation mode right now. No?
Nope.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so let me try. I don't know. Okay, so okay. I don't know what is happening here. It's the first time I'm using Canvas. My student says, "Oh, use Canvas is beautiful. The presentations have amazing colors
If
and
worse comes to worse, you can email them to me and I can just advance them on queue for you on my end, I think. If it's
okay, yeah, maybe, yeah. Let
I
me
don't know that
see.
that'll work either, but we can try it.
Let me try the last time.
My biggest problems arise when I switch from one system to the other, and then I don't know the new one.
Yeah.
Hi, Paulo. I think what I recommend is when it's asking you to share your screen, that you share the entire screen and not a specific browser.
Okay.
Because I think what's happening is it's selecting a browser for
Oh,
you.
yeah. Oh, perfect, Sarah. Thank you. Let me try that. Okay. Okay, my desktop. And now I will put in the presentation mode. That should be anywhere here. Here. Okay. And now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Sarah.
Victory.
Yes.
You
Yay,
saved the
Sarah.
day. Thank you. Okay. So I will start with those classic questions, and in this case, that question that what's morality, and we are all the time talking about morality, and sometimes I like to go back and think, okay, do we know exactly what we are talking about? Do you know what's morality? If I need to ask someone, okay, what's morality? What are you doing? And probably some of you would mention, for example, the difference between, I don't know, the right and wrong, or maybe a set of rules like don't lie, don't steal. And some will say, oh, it's the golden rules, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But it's beautiful, perfect rule, unless of course you happen to be a masochist. But it's a nice rule. And my question here is, okay, I was talking about, everybody are talking about the same thing, and the same thing is morality. So if you look at uh, uh, at psychology during the age, we're going to see uh, the schools of Piaget and then Kohlberg with the rationalist school, and then we're going to see Carol Gilligan, just to cite some of them, put in the ethic of care. And recently we start seeing people like Heidegger or Curry, or even people from biology like Franz de Waal, talking about some different things. And what is interesting at some of these perspectives are that morality includes ancient evolved mechanisms, and that they are designed not only for care, but to bind groups together. So here I am talking about loyalty, authority, sanctity, purity, and all these things. And usually the state function of these foundations is to create cohesion, cooperation, and things that is important to survive and thrive. And during my talk, I'll try to challenge some aspects of this expansion that we're seeing in psychology of morality. I'm not going to question whether, for example, binding exists. I think they are real, they are powerful, and they have consequence. But what I'm going to challenge is the label. So for example, when a psychological system consistently predicts harm to others, why do we still call them morality? You see my point? So that's my point. And and behind that is my thesis that I'm calling that we are calling everything morality. And my thesis here is that we are making a kind of category error, so we are mixing different things in the same place, in the same umbrella. For this presentation, I tried to think, okay, how can I frame this to discuss what I'm thinking and the data we have been collecting. And for me, we are mixing two different things that I'm calling the psychology of morality and the psychology of power. For me, this is part of the issue. So the psychology of morality, we can think as something that evolved to regulate interpersonal harm and fairness, while the psychology of power evolved to regulate groups, dynamics, enforce hierarchy, and ensure social control. And for me, one of the problems is that the psychology of power is a brilliant mimic of the psychology of morality. It kind of hijacks the language, the emotions of morality, like duty, loyalty, respect, purity. And in some ways, it ends legitimizing functionally in-group dominance and out-group exclusion. So I will present some of the studies we have been conducting here in my lab to address this issue. So our first step was to select a very broad set of moral measures currently used in the literature. You can see at the screen. So the idea was to capture a wide view of the moral domain, and we included scales that measure different aspects of what people are calling morality. So we have moral identity. We use the Aquino's moral identity scale. We divide this into internalization and symbolization. We use the moral identity questionnaire by Black and colleagues that measures what they call moral self and moral integrity. We also include the moral identity picture that's based on the dyadic moral theory proposed by Kurt Gray, and this moral identity, this moral identity picture scale, they kind of divide. They have four factors. So it's the hero, the benefactor, the victim, and the villain. So it's the idea of the agent and the victim. And we also include the classic moral foundation questionnaires that many people are using. And you have measures of individualizing, that's basically care and fairness, and the binding, which are loyalty, authority, and sanctity or purity. And finally, we include a scale that is derived from the theory of Lakoff about the moral politics. So it's a scale that allows us to see two main factors. One is called nurturing morality, which is focused on empathy and care, and the other is the strict morality, which focuses on rules, order, and discipline. So as you can see here, the screen have a lot of different pieces on the table. So identity, moral foundations, moral politics, and social moral roles. And the first question here is there any kind of structure behind all of these? Do they cluster together in any meaningful way? And to address that, we collected data from Brazil and the US, from all regions of both countries, representative samples, around 1,000 participants per country. And here you can see the distribution in both countries. And what we did, we ran a multiple correlation and applied a technique called multidimensional scaling. So you can think as this as taking the correlation data and use it to place it moral construct on a 2D chart, what you can see in this screen. So the closer two things are on the chart, the more related they are. So as you can see in this map, you can see that it creates three clusters. Cluster one was the biggest one. We would call moral identity, care, and fairness. Basically, it includes everything from internalization, moral self, moral integrity, nurture and morality, individualizing, and even the hero role. Then we have the cluster two, a very tight group we call tradition and obligation, composed by the binding foundations and the strict morality. And finally, we found another cluster that have those moral roles. So it's composed by the villain, the victim, and the benefactor. So this is the way these variables are grouped. So it kind of create a framework for how these different moral variables fit together. So, okay, so far we established that these instruments are just a random blob and anything like that. So they cluster into meaningful groups. And now we can move to our next question. So what these moral instruments predict? And so we first tested the power against a wide range of self-reported prejudices and social ideologies. So we look at whether these moral predictors could explain attitudes like sexism, prejudice against LGBT individuals, and racial prejudice, and also the core ideological support for group-based hierarchy, the social dominance orientation, to include the SDO as well. And for example, on this slide, you can see some sentence. So racial bias. So Black people have become too hostile in their demand for equal rights. Police use excessive force against Black people, and many other sentences that you can see here. A man's job is more important than a woman's. Women are better suited for taking care of children and the elderly. All this kind of things. So we also wanted to see if the person levels interfere in anyhow. So we included a moderator. We include the dark triads, basically Machiavellism, narcissism, and psychopathy, as you can see here at this slide. But now, if you think we have now lots of predictors, so we have like 12 moral aspects, then we have this dark triad, and also we have countries, Brazil and US. You start to multiplicate all the main effects and the moderators we are going to see, and the interactions we are going to see that we have multiple predictors. So the first thing we needed to do is to quite simplify the process. So I'll just briefly say what it did. So at the screen you can see the step by step that we did here. So in step one, we did what I'm calling the selection. So we split our data in 70% for training, 30% for testing. On the 70% training data, we run a model called ElasticNet. We ran it 200 times on bootstrapped samples of this training data, and then checked it with variables were selected as important across all those runs. And then we set a conservative high bar, only variables that were selected. 80% of those 200 runs were considered stable enough and allowed to move to the next step. So with this, we are filtering most of those variables that can have an impact, but it's too small to take the risk of putting in the second step. Then in the second step, we did what we can call the inference. So we take only those few stable predictors and we test them on 30% holdout data that the model has never seen before. And then we just run a simple standard OLS regression. And so we are trying to have an unbiased estimator of how strong these predictors really are. And finally, step three is focus more on robustness. So we repeated this entire process 5 times. And so the results I'm about to show you in the next slides. So they are the average results for those 5 runs. So when you see the results, you can be confident that any predictor that you see isn't just an artifact or anything like that. So it survived a very tough and conservative selection process. So let's see what we find. So here is about the LGBT prejudice. So I think the pattern, for me at least, is pretty clear. So first, we are seeing that the system that I'm claiming about power and group control, so the binding foundations, was the strong predictor of more prejudice. So here, the blue colors, the blue bars, means that if I value more the binding foundations, I am supporting more those sentences about LGBT prejudice. If it's red, is the opposite. Okay, so just I put it in this way just we could directly compare and see binding and individualizing and other ones. So if you look here, binding is the strongest predictor of more prejudice, and together with the strict father. And then when we see those systems focus on care and fairness, so the individualizing foundations, we see the exact opposite. So it was a strong, significant predictor of less prejudice. So For the LGBT and as well as nurture and father. So for LGBT prejudice, I think it's pretty clear that one system robustly predicts harm and exclusion, and the other protects against it. Let's see sexism now. So almost the same story. So once again, what I'm calling the psychology of power, the binding and strict father, significantly predict more sexist attitude. So binding foundation show a strong effect, and as well as the strict father. Conversely, that system I'm calling the psychology of morality, so individualizing and the nurture father, just as robustly predicts less sexism. So we see negative betas for both individualizing and nurturing father. And so for prejudice rooted in gender and sexuality, these two systems are not different types of morality. I think they are functionally opposite forces. Let's go now to the racial prejudice. Again, quite similar. So we are seeing again that binding is again a strong predictor of more racism, and while the individualizing functions in the opposite direction. And finally, we're going to look at the social dominance orientation, and this, what is not just about another kind of prejudice, is explicit ideological belief that some groups should dominate others. And if my thesis here is correct, SDO is the goal of the psychology of power. And the results, I think, are clear. So binding foundations is a massive predictor of higher SDO. The strict father model is also significant. And what is the break of this desire for dominance is what I'm calling the psychology of morality. So the individualizing foundations show a huge negative effect, and the nurturing models show one of its strong protective effects in the entire study. So I think the data is making my point clear, but whether this distinction holds up when people have to make an actual decision, because I'm just looking at those moral variables and how they kind of predict these self-reported measures. But to answer about decisions, we need to have some tests that allow us to test decisions. So I'm going to present now the second phase of this study, that when we presented participants with 4 distinct behavior scenarios where they had to make a concrete choice. So let's see what we did. So first, we have a hiring decision. So participants have to choose for a job interview between an immigrant candidate from an Islamic country with a great resume and a candidate from their own country with just a good resume. So it's a kind of a trade-off between perceived in-group preference and objective merit. Then we move to this, what I'm calling the sharing decision. So we measure their willingness to share a social media post from an NGO supporting equity for women, Black people, and immigrants. And so basically, if you see here, so would you share? So there is this sentence at the beginning. So the NGO Equity published a post on social media showing the impact of projects on the lives of women, Black people, and immigrants who face inequalities. And then they need to answer this thing. Would you share this content on your profile, knowing that this helps spread the cause? Share or don't share the post. Then we have these other decisions. So it's a kind of inclusion decision. So imagine you're forming a small group for an activity where everyone will have the same role. Among the interested people, there is a Black woman. You can decide whether she will participate or not. And basically, they need to say what to do, include this person in the group, do not include this person in the group. And finally, we have this reaction to to comment. So basically, you see a comment on social media saying homosexuals are always receiving opportunities they don't deserve, and how would you react? Do nothing or like the comment? So basically, we collect these 4 decision tasks and look on how those moral variables predict the way they decide. So let's see here. So so here, so this graph shows the odds ratio. So anything to the right of this dotted line greater than 1 means that variable increase the likelihood of the prejudice and inclusionary choice. Anything to the left is exactly the contrary. So it decreased that likelihood. So let's see what we have here. So here, look at the top left pane here, this one here. So the outcome here is the exclusionary choice. So rejecting the qualified immigrant in favor of the less qualified candidate. So binding and strict father, again, increases the odds of making this biased decision. So we can see it here, and you can see it here. And then the other one is liking a negative LGBT post. So the bottom left panel here. So what we find is binding was strong prediction. So here you can see here, and a significant predict increasing the likelihood that a person would like the hateful comment. And an interesting thing is that the individualizing act as a significant protective factor, decreasing the odds of doing that. Then the NGO here at the bottom at the right. So we don't find the effect of the binding, but we find the effect of the strict father, and also the effect of individualizing, protecting. So again, the same story, strict father predicting doing nothing regarding this NGO, and the other sharing these good things to the world. And in the top right, you have the inclusion of the Black woman in a group. And again, we are finding the individualizing. So here, predicting a decreased likelihood of excluding Black women from the group, not in fact including them in the group, and the binding here showing the opposite finding. So just turn here. So I'm approaching to the end, and we can summarize here. You can summarize these findings in some way. So when you come in this last test, so when you come to make a concrete decision to hire or to include or to support or to harm, so the system that we as scientists and philosophers are calling morality, the binding morality, function exactly like psychology of power. So they are predicting harm, they are predicting exclusion. So, and bias or inaction. So sometimes they do nothing. And the system that we usually call individualizing morality and care and fairness, they work as predicted. So it consistently predicted protection against bias, promoted fairness, and pro-social actions. So my key message here is that I think we are talking, when we are calling some dimensions as moral dimensions, I think we are doing something wrong. So morality and power for me are different things. So the systems focus on care and fairness, and the systems focus on loyalty and authority are not just different flavors of morality. I think they are functionally distinct and often behave in direct opposition to one another. Then I think, and I said that at the beginning of my talk, I think the psychology of power is a mimic. So, and a brilliant mimic, because it hijacks the emotion language of morality and to justify its functions in group dominance and out-group exclusion. And also one thing that I think it's important to have in mind is that function defines the system. So we should classify these systems by what they do. So one system functionally reduces harm and prejudice. The other functionally predicts harm and prejudice. And finally, I think it's at least is the way I think. I don't know. Our labels as scientists matter. So when you call the psychology of power morality, I think we are kind of obscuring a fundamental conflict. We should instead be analyzing this conflict for what it is. So moral aims and power aims that lies at the very heart of our social and political life. So that is my view of these things. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo. Okay. So questions. No questions. Oh, Linda, yes.
Okay, my question is whether this is really about power, if it all reduces to a conservative ideology. Conservatives don't like women, Black people, minorities, and so forth, and conservatism is very highly correlated with your SDO measures as well as the binding foundations and so on.
Yeah, I do agree, Linda, about that, and that's I think that's why I'm putting this discussion of morality the way I'm putting, because I think some people are sometimes are saying that okay, so liberals have this kind of morals, they value this kind of morals, conservatives they value this kind of morals, and at the end I say okay, they value this kind of morals, but if this morals that they value at the end harms people, can we really call them moral? I don't know. And so that's why I'm using the word power here. And yeah.
Thank you, that helps clarify that.
I think Paul.
Thank you. Great talk. Very interesting. And I'll probably be talking about this in my moral psychology class to my students next semester. I think my question is, you're defining morality in terms of the outcome, right? And I think someone like Jonathan Haidt would define morality as if someone who is conservative is thinking about this in a moral way, then it's morality by virtue of them thinking it is. So how do you handle this disconnect?
Yeah, that's a good question that I'm still trying to handle. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. And I start doing exactly what he did, looking at the outcome, because I think we're in a because I think we can think in terms of evolution and we can think in the world that we are living right now. And when you use some words, they are awesome to explain what might happen before and how we arrive right now. But right now, if we still use the same words to talk about what is morality, I think we're doing more harm than good, you know? And so that's why I'm putting in terms of labels, because sometimes I think if we as scientists and philosophers keep using the same words, we are just promoting more segregation, more harm than doing good. I don't know, but it's still something that yeah. And thank you, John, for your comment here. I for sure will look at Laura Niemi studies. Thank you for pointing that. Thank you very much.
So, Paolo, I'll ask a question. Is this a way of? I mean, it seems like you might want to say something like, "Well, look, we should just rename the five foundations, for instance, and what you're going to get is like two foundations of morality and three foundations of anti-morality."
Yeah. Or we should or we should make a huge meeting and deciding okay, let's decide some words because now it's my personal view, and maybe it's my view because I'm in Brazil and sometimes we are excluded of some discussions. And my view is that sometimes people are trying to create their own theories just to have their moral theories, and they are missing some points, you see what I mean, probably. so so I think sometimes in this case of moral foundations, I don't know, here in Brazil we're all the time trying to, not right now because that we stopped doing that, but we are all the time trying to validate the scales, see if they organize in the same factors, blah blah blah, and it's not the same. It's not the same. And then we can say, okay, probably there are some cultural issues interfering on the data, but then we start seeing that they are not predicting things as we would expect it some moral variables should predict. And then we start doing this thing we are doing right now. So putting people deciding things that harm others or exclude others or ignore others, and seeing exactly what kind of moral things or issues predict this in somehow. So I don't know. I think when we are talking about, for example, the authority and hierarchy, I don't know because it depends so much. I don't know if it's really my perspective is it's not moral at all. Hi, John.
I just want to I enjoyed the talk, but I thought it'd be instructive to put you in dialogue with Paul Bloom. So if I channel Paul's talk from last night, so
Mhm.
your perspective on the binding values, is they're associated with a lot of junk. Maybe we shouldn't call we could still call them values, but we shouldn't call them moral values.
Yeah.
And I take it Paul would say, in terms of consequences, all moral values are a mixed bag. Sometimes loyalty is okay, sometimes harm
Hmm.
avoidance okay, and sometimes
Hmm.
it's not. And
Hmm. Hmm.
so I'm not. It may be more than a terminological dispute. I'm guessing what Paul would say is, look, this stuff is clearly in the bucket of people thinking about things in moral
Yeah.
terms, right? And so what seems to be true to the experience is just to acknowledge that morality is not all seashells and balloons, not saying these things that many people think of as moral issues shouldn't properly be called that. So
Hmm.
there's a
Hmm.
choice to make there,
Yeah.
and I guess
Yeah.
what Paul would say is it's kind of true to history to
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. 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 Definitely right. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess
Uh,
Walter, is that?
so Paolo, very interesting. I mean, there's a lot to think about here. I have a kind of a big picture question, I guess, uh,
Yeah.
which is the idea that people who use the binding foundations to exclude homosexuals, gays, and women from jobs and things like that by saying that it's immoral, they're the ones that are using power and it's not real morality. Or
Hmm.
is the claim more general that all of morality is about power? I mean,
Hmm.
Nietzsche would say, look, the gay person who doesn't get hired, calls that unfair and immoral. Why? In
Yeah.
order to be able to get the job. Uh,
Yeah.
so they're just using their favored part of morality for their power, and the other side is using their favored side of morality for their power. But in both cases, uh, the moral claims are a means to increase their power and inclusion in the areas that they want to be included in.
Yeah. 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 Great. Yeah. It's a great way to reframe things. Yeah. Yeah. You're right.
So
Yeah.
then morality it becomes just a tool of power in your view. Is Is that the
Not
idea?
yeah, but not all morality. But I see what you mean. Yeah. That's maybe the point here to think, because uh, again, if you are thinking on the binding foundations, we are thinking on the way people on the way people inside the groups think in terms of their decisions and everything, and they can use the binding foundations to include or exclude, because as you said, you can exclude or include as well. And again, maybe this is not morality, this is just a way to kind of manipulate things to include or exclude, I don't know. So, and that's why I think I still hold on this thing that probably is not morality. It's just a way of control, it's just a way of making decisions and yeah.
There might be a difference when you're making the moral judgment on your own behalf instead of on somebody else's behalf. If I see
Mhm,
some gay person doesn't get a job on the other
mhm,
side of the country or the other side of
mhm,
the world, and it doesn't affect me in any personal way, uh,
mhm,
I might not be using it as a way of getting power myself. But when the person who's
mhm,
excluded from a job complains that it's immoral,
mhm.
then it's very different. I haven't thought
Yeah,
it through yet, but it does seem to me that who makes the moral judgment might affect whether it is simply a tool of power or not.
yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Paul has his hand
Paul,
up
did you
front.
have a follow-up question? I didn't remember. I can't tell. Mm, no. Okay.
Actually, I
But you
mean,
do. Okay, there you go. Sorry, I put it
well,
down just in time for you to come back. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, great. I just wanted to follow up and say that I really like this idea that moral judgments are a power statement, a power claim, a way of getting people to pay attention to you and to your needs. And
Hmm.
by saying, last night I was trying to make this point as well. I think it was Paul who said that even a young child can make a moral judgment, right? And
Hmm.
say, this is wrong, I deserve
Hmm.
dinner. But I would argue that by the act of a child making a moral judgment, they're trying to gain power in the situation and say, society requires to give me what I need here.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, arguably, if you look at your data in terms of top down, bottom up, in
Hmm.
terms of existing global power
Hmm.
structures,
Hmm.
the question becomes who do you align yourself with, the top or the bottom? And then both of them are arguably using morality or moral language to
Hmm.
fight for power in the middle.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Great point. Yeah. Thank you. No, thank you. And thank you. I'm seeing Daryl Cameron also put some comments here. Yeah, thank you guys for all these comments. It's really, yeah. So we are as Walter commented at the beginning, I'm running an institute of social and affective neuroscience, and we now have what I'm calling the observatory of morality, and we are running many experiments, and all these comments are great also to think on new on new questions and new experiments. So thank you very much for all the comments. Thank you.
We can entertain one more question if for Matt, if he's got it. I think we're okay on time.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Oh, yep.
So I think one thing that's important to distinguish is that there's a use of moral language that some people have been talking about where I'm going to make a claim on my behalf because it benefits me. And if I use moral language, you know, I might get my way. But typically, I mean, I think from like an ethicist standpoint, I regard that just as like an abuse of moral language.
Mhm.
So it's like if I care about justice, I should care about injustice to others, even when it's of no consequence to me.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
usually when we see people who advance claims using moral language, but it seems like they're just doing it on their own behalf,
Mhm.
their behavior is not really being guided by moral principles.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, I do stuff on self-regulation and goal theory, so it's like the moral goals are not in the driver's seat. It's just
Mhm.
self-interest, and that's
Mhm.
just using moral language as a means to an end.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think when we're thinking about what it is to be guided by morality, we really do want to be able to distinguish between internalized principles that are guiding conduct one way rather than another versus the instrumental use of moral language just because we think it'll potentially get our way.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, there's a lot of literature on this issue, like looking at the what is called the moral hypocrisy and all these things to show what people are saying or what people are doing and the use of moral language. And we in our experience there is a variable there is still trying to figure out what is happening is moral integrity. So like people saying, I don't lie, I don't cheat, I don't steal, and it predicted some kinds of racism and sexism. So probably it's like what you're saying. So sometimes we are using moral language and not following those rules and those moral issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Paula. That was, as every other talk, that was incredibly interesting. So we thank everyone, give them a round of applause here. Thank you very much for your
Oh,
presentation.
thank you guys. Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Give me just
Thank
a
you.
second here. I've got to do some pinning and unpinning. Okay, Daryl Cameron is going to introduce our keynote speaker.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Awesome. All right. So it's my pleasure to introduce the keynote for today. Linda Skitka is Professor Emerita of Psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She received her PhD from UC Berkeley. And as many of you, I'm sure, are well aware, her work focuses primarily on the psychology of moral conviction and how people idiosyncratically moralize the world around them. Her work has explored how moralized attitudes or moral convictions have different psychological characteristics than non-moral ones, which relates to many deep and persistent questions and debates in moral psychology, moral philosophy, political science. And her work on moral conviction and individual differences in moral perception has been very influential in our field. She's been a core contributor to social psychology as a whole, but also the evolution of the field of moral psychology. She was previously the president of Society for Personality and Social Psychology in 2019 and the Midwestern Psychological Association in 2018. She received the Distinguished Service Award from SBSB in 2016, and in 2023 was added to the SBSB Heritage Wall to recognize a lifetime of contributions to our field. She's received the Harold Laswell Award for Distinguished Scientific Contribution to Political Psychology from the International Society of Political Psychology and has received grants from the NSF, the John Templeton Foundation, and NASA, and even helped create a journal, the Journal of Social, Psychological, and Personality Science. For me, I've always appreciated how her work really encourages us as moral psychologists to think about our constructs and how we measure the things that we're studying. And it's in particular giving credence to the value of people's lived experiences and subjective experiences they bring to our experiments and studies. And I think building on some of the very conversations this morning, thinking about and even challenging some of the taxonomies that as scientists, we try to use to carve out how exactly moral decision making works. And so again, I think her influence has been felt in many of the talks this morning, including the previous two, and I look forward to hearing her talk more about her work.
Now let's see if I can share. Okay, is everyone seeing this not in presenter view?
Yes, that's correct.
Excellent. Okay. I'm realizing that actually I haven't given a PowerPoint in a little while, and so I all of a sudden got very nervous about like, am I going to be able to do this correctly? Because I didn't practice that part. But thank you, Daryl, for that very kind introduction. And before I really dive into today's talk, I want to express my gratitude to the Morality Research Group for inviting me to deliver this keynote. The interdisciplinary work being fostered here, bridging philosophy and psychology, represents exactly the kind of collaborative inquiry our field needs, and I appreciate being part of the conversation. Today, I want to explore a phenomenon that sits at the intersection of our disciplines. That is, the processes by which attitudes shift in and out of the moral domain. As we'll see, understanding these dynamics has the potential to address age-old debates in our field about the roles of reason and emotion and how people think about morality. Let me begin first by discussing the concept of an attitude and how moral conviction relates to it. An attitude is a perception. People organize their thoughts about an attitude object to derive their evaluation of it, generally on a positive to negative continuum. And meta-perception, in contrast, are thoughts about a perception. For example, that I might perceive that my attitude about a given attitude object is positive or negative. Whether I also perceive that positive or negative attitude is evaluably strong, certain, or important, or as a moral conviction, would be meta-perceptions about that attitude, what I think about my attitude. Psychologists measure attitudes and meta-perceptions about them by asking participants to share their perceptions and meta-perceptions of that attitude object. For example, how much do you support or oppose recent efforts to deport illegal immigrants in the US would be asking about an attitude. We might ask about attitude strength by asking people how strong their position is, how certain it is, how important it is. Or take into account the evaluative extremity they were on the support or opposition scale. My program of research began by asking whether meta-perceptions that an attitude is a moral conviction is something distinct from attitude strength. For example, whether an attitude is evaluably strong, certain, or important. I should note that this is a very bottom-up approach to studying morality as well. Instead of the researcher defining what will count as moral, we ask our participants what they perceive as moral, something that to some degree addresses Paulo's concern about all these things that are being called moral these days, but that may or may not really be about morality. And if morality is in fact a meta-perception, a perception that we have about, for example, an attitude, we should observe individual differences in moral convictions people have, even about normatively moral issues. Take, for example, abortion. This is what we find. There's actually considerable individual differences in whether people have a meta-perception that their attitude about abortion is a moral one. It is roughly evenly distributed. We're a little bit more extreme on the high end of this one than we might be on some other issues, but it's certainly not the case that everybody sees their position on abortion a reflection of their core moral convictions. And in fact, you can reasonably think that some people's position on abortion might instead just reflect a preference. They just might prefer to have a backstop birth control method and not see it in a particular moral light. It just serves their self-interest. Other people's attitude about abortion might reflect a convention. This is what people in my faith community happen to think about abortion, so I'll think that way too. If for some reason my faith community were to change its position, I would probably adopt my position as well. And of course, some people do see their attitude about abortion with the strength of moral conviction. But we can understand why there might be variance there. And it turns out that variance in moral conviction has some unique characteristics. As compared to weaker moral convictions or compared to otherwise strong but non-moral attitudes. And that is that attitudes that are experienced as moral convictions are seen as more absolute and universally true. This should be true for my group, but also any other group, even though I may be wildly unfamiliar with anything about their cultural context. They're perceived as factual and as akin to 2 + 2 = 4. So if you ask somebody why something they're morally convicted and opposed to why that would be wrong, they would struggle to answer that question because it just self-evidently is. Moral convictions are also authority independent. People are much less likely to care about what authorities have to say about the matter, including God, because they happen to know the right answer in this particular case. They have ties with strong emotions. And they're also motivating and perceived as obligatory. We've also been studying the consequences of attitudes held with moral conviction. For example, in one study, we examined whether having a moral conviction about an outcome would eliminate what is known as the fair process effect. The fair process effect refers to a widely replicated finding. That is, that people will accept unfavorable outcomes from authorities if the decision was made using fair procedures. where fair procedures are defined as being treated with dignity and respect and having an opportunity for voice in the process. But are all negative and unfavorable outcomes the same? Or are morally convicted outcome preferences special? If moral convictions really are authority independent, then people shouldn't care about how authorities make the decision. They should primarily care about whether the correct outcome is achieved. To find out whether this is the case, we did a longitudinal study of reactions to a Supreme Court decision about whether the states can legalize physician-assisted suicide. Long before the Supreme Court heard our arguments in the case, we contacted a nationally representative sample of adults in the US and asked them their standing perceptions of the court. This included measures of the perceived legitimacy of the court, its procedural fairness, and how much they trusted the court to make the right decision. In addition to these questions, we asked participants about their own position on physician-assisted suicide and the degree to which their attitude on this issue reflected their moral and religious convictions. We collected the latter to examine how much moral and religious convictions overlap. And by the way, it turns out they correlated about 0.3, and that's across a whole range of issues. But to also control for religious conviction to discover whether moral conviction has unique effects on perceptions of the court's fairness. We then waited for the court to hear arguments in the case and to announce its decision, which in this case, they did uphold states' rights to legalize physician-assisted suicide. And then we contacted the same people again and got the same judgments of the perceptions of the standing of the court, as well as judgments of how fair they thought the decision was and whether it was binding. Before getting into the results, I want to orient you to this graph. As you can see, unique variance is on the y-axis. Basically, what I'll be presenting are effect sizes for religious conviction, pre-decision perceptions of the standing of the court, which is the combined effects of procedural fairness, legitimacy, and trust, and the effect of moral conviction by attitude interaction. Let's look at religious conviction first. Given most, if not all, religions have prohibitions against self-harm, not surprisingly, we found that higher levels of religious conviction were associated with lower levels of fairness and decision acceptance. Again, the court ruled in a way that would be displeasing to people who had religious objections to self-harm. Religious conviction explained about 8% of the variance in outcome fairness and decision acceptance. Next, we tested whether moral conviction could explain any unique variance once religious conviction was already in the model. And we found that it did. The blue bars represent the unique explained variance of the moral conviction by attitude, position, interaction. When opposition to physician-assisted suicide was high rather than low, in moral conviction, people saw the outcome as unfair and non-binding. In contrast, when supporters' moral convictions increased, so too did their perception of the outcome was both fair and binding when they supported the court's decision. The moral conviction by position interaction explained about 8.5 of the variance in outcome fairness and decision acceptance. And again, this is a unique effect, controlling for religious conviction and perceptions of legitimacy. Next, we tested the effects of standing perceptions of the court, which you can see in the red bars here. Surprisingly, standing perceptions of the court explain no unique variance in outcome fairness and decision acceptance judgments when the effects of religious and moral conviction were controlled. In other words, when people have a moral or religious commitment to a decision outcome, it doesn't matter how positively they viewed the court before yielding its decision. The only thing that predicted their subsequent reactions to the decision was whether they perceived the court as getting the question right. We turn next to actually explore whether whether knowing the outcome of the decision actually changed people's subsequent opinion of the court. And what you can see here with the red lines is that the religiously convicted did not hold a grudge. Despite really not liking the decision very much, they nonetheless did not adjust their perceptions of the court's standing. The morally convicted, however, did react and changed their perceptions of the court as a function of whether or not it ruled consistently with their outcome preferences. People who liked the decision subsequently saw the Supreme Court as more procedurally fair, legitimate, and trustworthy after making the decision than they did before. Whereas those who disliked the decision saw the Supreme Court as less procedurally fair, less legitimate, and less trustworthy. We've subsequently replicated these results in two other court decisions, specifically the court's decision to federally legalize same-sex marriage and to overturn Roe v. Wade. This and other research establishes the authority independence of moral convictions. What we think is kind of happening here is that in many cases there's ambiguity about what the outcome of a court case should be, such as whether a given defendant is really guilty or innocent. And in these circumstances, people probably use things like procedural fairness and legitimacy as proxy variables to decide if verdicts are fair. However, when people believe they know the right outcome, the only thing that matters to their fairness judgments is whether the right outcome is achieved. They kind of use it as a litmus test of the legitimacy of the court. Moral convictions have a variety of other consequences as well. For example, stronger moral convictions are negatively associated with willingness to accept compromise on the part of oneself or others. Attitudes experienced with stronger moral convictions are perceived as more obligatory than those that reflect weaker no moral conviction, in which case it's not surprising that strength of moral conviction also predicts engaging in activism and turning out to vote. Finally, people are willing to accept any means so long as they arrive at morally preferred conclusions, including lying, cheating, and even violence. Discovery of the multitude of effects of moral conviction on a host of things begs the question: how do attitudes become moralized in the first place? And is it possible to demoralize attitudes? And that's going to be the goal of the remainder of the research I'm going to be discussing with you today, is attempts to moralize and demoralize attitudes. But first, let's discuss a little theory about what might lead to attitude moralization or demoralization. There are two major theoretical perspectives in social psychology that provide some hints. The social intuitionist model of morality focuses on the power of gut feelings or intuitions that are often signaled by strong emotions like disgust as primary and sufficient to lead to moralization. In this viewpoint, considerations of harm are post hoc rationalizations of these aroused intuitions. In contrast, the theory of dyadic morality posits that recognition of harm and only harm is what leads to moralization. And essentially that it requires a dyadic relationship where there's a harm-causing agent and a victim or patient. The sim implies that moralization and demoralization require dialing up and down of emotional reactions to the attitude object, whereas the dyadic theory of morality implies that dialing up or down perceptions of harm are what should moralize an attitude or demoralize it. In other words, one pathway to moralization or demoralization appears to be through the heart, and the other is through mind and reasoning. I'm not the first one to be interested in the processes that lead to attitude moralization. There's been growing interest in this topic in the literature in recent years. And so what have we learned so far? What we've learned so far is emotion, but not intuition, can lead to increased attitude moralization. Emotions that have been found to move around the moralization of different attitude objects include disgust, anger, hostility, and even enthusiasm. But what you don't find is any carryover effects. For example, although enthusiasm about one's preferred candidate in an election cycle might increase your strength of moral conviction about him or her, that enthusiasm does not carry over to affect your feelings or moral convictions about your non-preferred candidate. In addition, other research has indicated that people have to have superliminal levels of awareness of whatever is the evocative cue that might lead to moralization for moralization to occur. When witnessing the same evocative cue at subliminal levels of awareness leads to no moralization change. There's some studies that do find some evidence for harm, but they're fewer, and the results for perceived harm are relatively inconsistent. And there's some limitations of the studies of attitude moralization so far. So far, all researchers studied very familiar attitude objects, and often ones that are pretty politicized, which makes one wonder if so far we've only studied moral amplification. That is how you increase an existing moral conviction, and not moral recognition, as recognizing the moral significance of an object and moving from there. And no research to date, to my knowledge, has studied attitude demoralization. So the goal of research I want to turn to next was to take an attitude that is clearly in the domain of preference and convention and try to move it into the domain of moral imperative. We also wanted to do the reverse, that is, take an attitude in the domain of moral imperative and move it into the domain of preference and convention. We had a number of selection criteria for the attitude objects that we would study. We wanted comparatively familiar and novel to participants attitude objects. We needed attitude objects that were in different starting domains, preferences on convention on one hand, moral imperative on the other, but would be otherwise very similar. We wanted this for increased comparability and control. And we needed, for strong arguments, moralize or demoralize to be available. Fulfilling these different criteria led us in a perhaps squeamish space. Specifically, the attitude objects that seemed to fulfill all of these criteria well was attitudes towards male versus female circumcision. Male circumcision is very normative in the US and widely accepted. Female circumcision is something most people in the US are not even particularly aware it happens, but when they learn about it, they generally find it to be morally reprehensible. And there is available scientific evidence that reveals a perhaps surprising amount of harm that can come from male circumcision, in addition to the problem of bodily autonomy. It's usually done in newborn boys who do not have the capacity for consent. Moreover, there's another body of research that challenges objections to female circumcision. It usually involves a symbolic nick to the clitoral hood without removing any tissue, so it's not as severe as most people imagine it would be. It's a female-centric practice controlled by women. So this is nothing about a patriarchy imposing something on women. It has limited effects on sexual functioning and is usually done at an age that allows for consent. And before going further in this, I want to introduce you to Paul Tees, who did the heavy lifting with this research. I had been pitching the idea of this project to my students for some time, and most demurred after crossing their legs. Paul took it on despite having no enthusiasm about the choice of attitude objects we were going to study, and given that he had discovered the literature to find the arguments that we needed. Although initially squeamish, Paul has much more fully embraced ownership of the project over time. He even sent me this avatar to use in this talk. Okay, let's turn to the research. Turning to the studies, we first ran a pilot study to confirm our assumption that male circumcision was more in the domain of preference and convention, and female circumcision was in the domain of moral imperative. As you can see, male circumcision was perceived as more conventional and preferential than female circumcision, and female circumcision was perceived as more of a moral issue than male circumcision. In our first study, we presented participants with different frequently asked questions about male circumcision. For example, how beneficial or harmful it is, how painful, and so on. The FAQ topics were presented in random order, and participants could click on them to find out more information. For each FAQ, we provided 3 relevant facts from the scientific literature. For male circumcision, all the facts indicated the practice has harms, is painful, and so on. I want to emphasize there was no deception. All the information shared came from the existing scientific literature. Because learning any one of the facts could have multiple consequences. For example, learning about harm might change someone's perception of how common the practice is, or how much it represents an autonomy violation. And because people could respond emotionally to any of them, we were primarily interested in the possible mediators of the FAQs on moral conviction. We also measured support or opposition to the practice, which could range from strongly to support to strongly opposed, and control for it in our subsequent analyses. That means any effect that I'm going to show you for moral conviction is not due to attitude change. First, we checked to make sure that reading the FAQs had the intended effects on perceptions of harm and so on, and we found that they did. We were also interested in examining what information participants freely chose to read about, as well as the order in which they read them. The median number of FAQs that participants chose to read was 2. By the way, we insisted all of them had to read a minimum of 1. And this was something the same across all the studies where participants could freely choose to which FAQs they would read. Most participants chose to read about bodily harm and tended to read this FAQ first. Whether they read about normative information, sexual function, and pain was more evenly distributed, and participants were least likely to read about autonomy. What do we find? This path diagram depicts the only significant effects we observed. Reading about pain increased experienced negative emotion, which in turn predicted increased moral conviction. Reading about the degree of autonomy men have about the choice to be circumcised directly increased moral conviction, but had no mediated effect. So study 1 revealed that negative emotions moralized attitudes about male circumcision. Perceptions of harm, painfulness, and so on did not. Although this represented a promising start, we should note that we used a between subjects design in this study. In other words, we only asked participants moral conviction after they read the FAQs. The advantage to this design is that it reduces experimental domain characteristics or consistency pressures. The disadvantage is that it does not establish within-person change in moral conviction. For this reason, for study 2, we shifted to a within-subject design. The only change we made to the study design was asking participants their attitude and moral conviction several days before they completed the rest of the study, in addition to after. In the pretest of participants' attitudes about moral conviction, we also included a variety of other attitude objects and topics, just to lessen the salience of male circumcision as an issue, and therefore hopefully resist pressures towards consistency over time. Which FAQs did participants read? The pattern results looked almost exactly the same as we observed in study 1. As you can see by the non-overlapping confidence intervals, participants reported stronger moral conviction after reading the FAQs than they did before reading them. So we do see some evidence of moralization. What predicted moralization? Well, we replicated the finding observed in study 1 that reading the pain FAQ increased negative emotion and increases in negative emotion in turn predict increased moral conviction about the issue. In this case, however, autonomy did not have a direct effect on moral conviction. So study 2 replicated study 1, negative emotion moralizes. I should note, however, that studies 1 and 2 left information exposure free to vary because participants could choose how many additional FAQs to read after the first one and could read a few or many. This could introduce a certain amount of noise into the results because not everybody was getting the same information. For this reason, in study 3, we controlled information exposure by experimentally manipulating it. In study 3, therefore, participants were randomly assigned to read all the FAQs or none of the FAQs. And then we took the same measures of mediating variables and measured people's moral conviction and support and opposition to the practice. As you can see, due to the non-overlapping confidence intervals, being exposed to the information led to increased moralization of attitudes about male circumcision than no exposure. And the results largely replicated studies 1 and 2. The strongest predictive pathway was through negative emotion. Perceived harm had, however, had an unexpected effect on moral conviction, an effect that only emerged when negative emotion was in the equation, which means this is an example of the suppressor effect. And that is FAQ exposure increased perceptions of a harm. However, increased perceptions of a harm negatively predicted moral conviction. We would have to do this study again to see if it actually replicated, but this may be an example of some reactants. So the take-home conclusion of studies 1 through 3 is that emotions moralize attitudes. Despite stacking the deck by presenting loads of harm information, perceived harm consistently failed to moralize attitudes. All the action came through negative emotion. Turn next to explore whether studying attitudes about female circumcision by conducting 3 additional studies using the same approach we used to study male circumcision. The only difference was the content of the FAQs, which were designed to reduce concerns about the practice, as opposed to increase them. Study 1 used exactly the same design as, study 4 used exactly the same paradigm as study 1. Once again, the manipulation checks worked. And what the FAQs did participants read first? In this case, about 50% of participants read about bodily harm first, when it was closer to 70 for, well, sorry, I know it was only 6.5% higher in the male circumcision studies. And participants, 9 to 13% of them expressed more interest in each of the other FAQs than what we observed for male circumcision. However, like the male circumcision case, participants were least interested in reading about autonomy. So basically, the information that people considered was more diffuse for female than it was for male circumcision. What effects did we find? None. Reading the FAQs had the expected effects on perceptions of harm and so forth, but none of these effects carried over to affect moral conviction. Although very preliminary, this may suggest that moralized attitudes are more resistant to persuasive appeal than conventional or preferential attitudes. Like our study 1, study 4 used a between subjects design, which also may not have enough statistical power to detect within person or detect change. And it's more powerful to demonstrate within person change than necessarily demonstrating between person change. So we turned next to doing exactly that. We measured time 1 moral conviction about female circumcision several days before we participants engaged in the rest of the experiment. And in this case, all but one manipulation check worked. Reading the FAQs did not affect how common people thought the practice was, but everything else worked as intended. Which FAQs did participants read? Replicated exactly what we found in our first female circumcision study. The pattern looked virtually the same. And this time we did see reductions in moral conviction from before to after reading the FAQs. In other words, we saw evidence of attitude demoralization. What predicted attitude demoralization? Learning that the effects of female circumcision doesn't negatively affect female sexual functioning predicted lower levels of perceived harm that in turn predicted weaker moral conviction in the study. Every other study we've done so far, it was negative emotion, but in this particular study, perceived harm was explaining attitude demoralization effects. So good news, attitude demoralization is possible. Reduction in perceived harm predicted weaker moral convictions. However, like studies 1 and 2 with male circumcision, exposure to the FAQs was not controlled in studies 4 and 5. So participants could have very variable amounts of FAQs they were exposed to. So we in study 6, I'm sorry, that's supposed to say study 6. We conducted a version of the study where participants were randomly assigned to read all or none of the FAQs. Once again, we did see evidence of attitude demoralization. Participants who read all the FAQs reported lower moral conviction about female circumcision than those who were exposed to none of them. In contrast to the previous study I just shared with you, negative emotion and non-perceptions of harm mediated the effect of FAQ exposure on moral conviction. Reading the FAQs aroused lower levels of negative emotion, which in turn led to weaker moral convictions relative to control. So in a summary of studies 4 through 6, in study 4, we found that the FAQ led to changes in every perceptual variable, but did not lead to changes in moral conviction. Study 5, perceived harm mediated the effects of reading the FAQs on subsequent moral conviction. In study 6, negative emotion mediated the effects of reading the FAQs on subsequent decreases in moral conviction. Although quite mixed. Well, first, the results with male circumcision were very consistent. Our findings were that the negative emotions moralized attitudes about male circumcision. However, the evidence was more mixed when you come to female circumcision. One possible take-home message of these studies is that attitude demoralization appears to be a heavier lift than male circumcision. Especially the contrast between the null results of study 4 and the observing results in study 6 is particularly interesting. Both used between subject designs, but in study 4, participants only read a couple of the FAQs on average, whereas in study 6, they read all 5. I remember there's 3 facts presented within each one of those FAQs. So even though emotion mediated the effects of the FAQs in study 6, participants clearly had to do a lot of cognitive elaboration to get there. Reading only 1 or 2 FAQs wasn't enough to sufficiently diffuse negative emotional reactions about the practice. It took reading a ton of them. This finding complicates the idea that attitude demoralization would either be all about emotion versus reason. It clearly requires both, even if it's less clear whether it necessarily involves harm. Similar levels of cognitive elaboration. Whoops, sorry, folks. I have no idea where here I am. Similar levels of cognitive elaboration, however, didn't appear to be necessary to moralize an attitude. Again, we observed effects regardless of how much information participants read about male circumcision. None of what it presented so far speaks to the desirability of holding moral convictions and whether efforts to moralize or demoralize an attitude would have positive or negative consequences. One can certainly argue that moral convictions could be normative goods, and therefore attitude moralization would have positive consequences. For example, moral convictions are predictive of increased charitable giving, volunteerism, voting, things that are generally considered normative goods. It also is implicated in fighting for a cause, even when it's costly to do so. And there's certainly suggestions, given the authority independence effects, that moral convictions could reduce mindless and destructive obedience to malevolent authorities. However, one can also mount an argument that moral convictions are normally bad things, and that attitude moralization would have negative consequences. This is building a theme that Paul shared with us yesterday. That is that morality has a dark side. As moral convictions increase, so too does blindness to due process and the rule of law. It can increase backlash against the legitimacy of institutions and authorities. It's associated with the acceptance of lying, cheating, and even violence to get morally preferred ends. And history is replete with atrocities that were justified by invoking morality and that were perpetuated on victims who were equally convinced of their own moral principles. In the end, the desirability of moralizing or demoralizing any given attitude will be in the eye of the beholder, something likely to be shaped by their group memberships and loyalties. Has become evident in our affectively polarized landscape, any given attitude can be perceived as the height of righteousness or akin to evil. Although moral convictions clearly help motivate people to get involved in noble causes, moral convictions can also be very dangerous, especially in the context of intergroup conflict. For this reason, finding ways to dial down the moral temperature is as or more important as discovering what dials up moralization. And I hope I can encourage some of those listening today to continue to study the question of attitude demoralization. And I will end there. I again thank you for listening. I want to thank Paul Tees for all his work on this project. And we can open it to questions.
Thank you. That was amazing, Linda. Hold on one second. Let me change the screen here. Okay. All right, so questions. Joanna.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Um, I was I'm thinking about um moral, well, potentially attitudes that you can have about a problem, say whatever it is, abortion, for example, and you come to the conclusion that you think this policy is morally permissible, but you felt like you had to do a lot of grappling to get to that conclusion. But you think, okay, it's morally fine. Can is there any sense in which that attitude can express moral conviction without being, so it's not an attitude that's saying something is wrong or something's obligatory, you're actually just coming to the conclusion that it's fine. On your way of understanding moral conviction, is that a moralized attitude or is that something quite different?
Let me see if I'm not understanding you correctly. That somebody has thought a lot about an issue and they do decide it's moral?
Yeah.
Is that right? That would probably be moral conviction then.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful.
Sure.
Hi, Linda.
Hi,
Oh,
Paul.
go
How
ahead.
are you doing?
Sorry.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, a great talk as usual. I'm also interested in this idea that people had to sort of expose themselves to a lot of this information in order to drag their attitude along. And I guess what I'm wondering, to that degree, do you think this is about capacity or is this more about motivation? Are some people just not capable of doing this process, or is everyone capable if we could just give them a bit more of a, a boot?
Um, I should say that if you look at percentages of the people who moved on moral conviction and within subject design, there was over half of them didn't move at all in the attitude demoralization studies. So, although we got on average demoralization effects, again, it suggests it's a pretty heavy lift. So in some cases, and I think this is very theoretically plausible, there might be no amount of information you could provide them that would persuade them to dial down their moral conviction. If you think about the characteristics of moral convictions that they are seen as akin to facts, they would probably be very highly motivated to be skeptical of, for example, our scientific evidence that it wasn't as harmful as they may have initially presumed. Whereas, in contrast, people don't have the same kind of psychological investment in their attitudes that they hold as preferences and conventions. Most people probably have not thought about or developed even a strong attitude about, for example, male circumcision. This is not something that we commonly think about. And it turned out not to take a terrific amount of information to dial up people's moral convictions on that topic, once you actually got them to think about it in terms of like, well, it could have some harms.
So should we conclude it's easier to dial up than dial down, or is it possible that the dialing down in this case, in this the actual reduction in harm is not that large psychologically. In another case, if you had a stronger reduction in harm, like it'll never happen again, then perhaps, you'd show more movement.
I would say that the first interpretation is where I'm landing, that it's just harder to demoralize an attitude. And there's research that indicates that attitudes are like possessions, that people value them and integrate them oftentimes in their sense of identity. That also seems to be likely to be higher for attitudes high in moral conviction than attitudes weak in moral conviction, and would contribute to resistance to persuasive appeal.
Janet, do you have a question? Looks like you're raising your hand. You can.
Yeah, I did. I was trying to figure out how to do the virtual
no
hand, and I couldn't find the button. Yeah,
I've got
thank
you
you, Linda.
covered.
It's
I've got
very
you covered.
interesting. Yeah, thanks. That was very interesting. And of course, I was thinking about climate change and demoralization of it and moralization of it, and moralizing it to the impact of people, moralizing the impact of animals, moralizing all those sorts of moral sides. But the other position of demoralizing it and like the use of disinformation or motivated demoralization. Um, what are your thoughts about moralizing and demoralizing and motivated efforts to do one or the other?
I think when we became more aware that climate change was having negative impacts for the climate, I don't think initially that people necessarily had a moral conviction in opposition to it. I'm not even sure if they do now, or if it's, it seems like most attitudes, negative attitudes about addressing climate change are really based on instrumental factors about, for example, not wanting to spend the money to do it or to take on the hit on institutional costs of building up infrastructure. I haven't done the research to find out if people are more morally convicted about addressing climate change than they are about resisting efforts to address climate change. But my top head thought is that resistance is largely instrumental and based on group loyalties. If Republicans in the United States, for example, were to suddenly do an about face on the necessity of addressing climate change, I'm guessing most Republicans would follow lead. So much of this is due to elite Q following.
I guess I was thinking it now. I was thinking some other things when you're saying that it's moralization is relative moralization sometimes. So it's not just how much does it cost. Is you want to spend your money on this, or do you want to spend your money on climate change? And so it's pitting one moral belief against a different moral belief.
I think sometimes that could be true. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay, John?
Thank you for that. I was wondering if negative emotion is an engine for moralization. I was wondering about positive emotion and how that might figure into the story. So I remember seeing in the poster in a teaching hospital with a beautiful and suspiciously healthy child in a hospital bed, and it said, "Sure, we had to sacrifice some lab animals. We think it was worth it." And one way of thinking about this is this sunny scene teaches you that lab animals are getting slaughtered is not a moral issue, but it might be just reconfiguring a moral issue. But yeah, so I was wondering if you thought the symmetry was if you can get people thinking in sunny ways, are they less prone to moralizing?
Yeah, the one study that I know that studied positive emotion was a collaboration with Mark Brandt. We studied people's attitudes about their preferred and non-preferred candidates over an election cycle. So we were looking for longitudinal changes in moral convictions about preferred and non-preferred candidates. And what we found in that particular one was that as enthusiasm for one's preferred candidate went up, the more strongly people became morally convicted in that preference for that candidate over the election cycle. And in contrast, the more hostile they got towards their non-preferred candidate, the more morally convicted they became about that candidate. The no crossover effects, the positivity you feel towards your preferred candidate didn't affect moral conviction about your non-preferred and vice versa. In this study, we also found longitudinal effects that emotions were both prior to changes in moral conviction and a consequence of them, of changes. In contrast, perceived harm and benefits of electing one or another candidate was only a consequence of changes in moral convictions and was not an antecedent. So it's only evidence that kind of gets at what you're thinking of, but I think you're coming up with a good suggestion for a study on how to perhaps demoralize an attitude is by changing positive emotions as well. Okay, so it's not only decreasing negative affect, which is what we found in this study. We measured positive affect, but there was no action there. But there's a possibility in other contexts that increasing positive affect about the alternative to your moralized attitude could have the same effect.
One possibility is, I mean, one possibility is that it's not valence of affect that's doing work, it's intensity of affect. So both positive and negative affect are moralizing. That'd be another alternative.
Yeah, I think that may well be the case. And, you know, again, taking that election study in contrast with other studies, for whatever reason, researchers have tended to focus on negative emotions instead of considering positive emotions. But I'm pretty persuaded that positive emotions have just as much power, and that it is emotional intensity.
Thank you.
Okay, Daryl.
Yeah, a really excellent talk, Linda. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Daryl.
And I guess my question, building on Paul and Janet's points, you know, we've been really interested in motivations and the willingness to engage with moral emotions question and capacity versus propensity and so forth. And it made me wonder with some of your work, you know, we found that people are more willing to like cultivate negative feelings of outrage to the degree they feel morally convicted about the issues in question. So we have some evidence on this. And I wonder to what extent you've considered the role of, in addition to like partisan elite cueing, things like cognitive effort, like metacognitive perceptions of ease of engaging with emotions related to moral convictions, in addition to some of the social disambiguation cueing points. And if you mentioned this in your talk, my apologies for missing it.
No, I did not mention it in the talk, and no, I have not thought about that. And I think it's a really interesting question. Although perhaps somewhat related to what you're finding, that there has been some research coming out of the Netherlands that indicates that intergroup conflict by itself moralizes. Yeah, that the more part of the differences that people see between their political in-group and the out-group on a given topic, the more moralized people are. Which doesn't get into the effort part, but it does get into the outrage and fact that just interpersonal relations may be implicated here as well.
Great, thank you.
And by the way, please send me a paper when you got it written up.
Will do, thanks.
Okay, Melton.
Hi, Linda. Thank you for a great talk. I found this work really exciting, and I agree that emotions can be important for moralization or demoralization. That being said, I'm interested in your thoughts on, can you moralize anything, or what's the limit to moralization? Because some of the items you've used are things that, for instance, circumcision, male or female, it still involves some bodily harm or potential to frame it as harm. And part of the reason I'm asking is when I think of studies done with younger kids, kids don't necessarily respond to affective reactions if it's for no reason at all. So if somebody is hurt and shows negative affect, kids sympathize with them, help them out. But when they're doing something, but when the adult is distressed for no reason whatsoever, or really exaggerating, being a crybaby, as they call it, kids also don't react to that. So they're really distinguishing something that is affective but deserves that affective reaction or emotional reaction from things that don't necessarily deserve that same degree. So I was wondering, do you think that would apply to moralizing
Yes, I think it
things?
does. For example, we don't find that incidental emotion carries over to affect moral convictions. It has to be attitudinally relevant. For example, in one study, we were showing people pictures of aborted fetuses, other examples of human harm, similarly disgusting pictures like overflowing toilets versus control images. Being exposed to these, and we were looking for changes in people's moral convictions about abortion. It was only when they were exposed to the aborted fetuses and abortion relevant stimuli that we got changes in moral conviction, not any of the other equally disgusting or emotionally evocative images didn't carry over. It affected at all. So it feels to me very similar to the kids. It's got to have some connection to what's going to be moralized. And again, in that study, we presented the stimuli as supraliminal levels of awareness versus subliminal levels of awareness. We were really trying to get this intuition idea. And no, people had to be consciously aware of what the stimuli was and how it was relevant to the attitude.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, everybody join me in thanking Professor Skitka for today, and thanks to everybody for showing up for the event more generally. I said I would share just very quickly at the end of all this the QR code for those of you who want it. If you want to take the survey, not it's not a survey. If you want to, sorry, if you want to give us your email address as we try to build a bigger listserv, we would welcome that as well. Okay, well, thanks again to everybody. Thanks to the data blitzers earlier today. Thanks to the participants. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to the attendant. Thanks to everybody. It was great.
Thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks for Thomas for putting it together.
Yes, thanks to Thomas. Thank you all.
All right, you guys, it was good to see everybody.
Cheers.